Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is George and I've been building homes since I was 18 years old, much like my father and my grandfather before me. And I've constructed all kinds of homes from whimsical log cabins to wood homes, self-assemblies and brick homes, as well as renovating people's properties, modernising them or refurbishing them back to their original pristine condition. You name it, and I've probably turned my hand to it with as much gusto and enthusiasm as a kid opening a Christmas present, as such is my passion for what I do. I've always been a pioneering spirit with creative and revolutionary ideas. Even on family beach holidays as a young boy, instead of surfing the waves, I would be building ingenious castles in the sand. So I think building things has always been in my blood, and I was always a dab hand with Lego blocks, I have to tell you. I have worked in building projects pretty much all over Appalachia, most especially West Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina, Georgia and Ohio, although I have built a couple of homes in Pennsylvania as well. My family has a home base in Georgia where we have a small plot of land all of our own and a pretty little red brick house that was actually inspired by a random trip to Barcelona where I fell in love with a red brick house I saw there and came back to recreate the stunning masterpiece myself. It's a very pretty home, and the red brick does a lot to enhance the sumptuous rich greens of the shrubbery, trees and grass. Our house is an idyllic place, surrounded by exquisite views where we raise free-range chickens, a couple of horses, and grow our own vegetables. During the week, my wife spends her time at home, raising our two young children, Tammy and Garth. I always return home for the weekends to spend as much time as possible with my family, which is imperative as my children will grow up so quickly and I want to enjoy every moment of their childhoods and not miss out on a thing. During the week I live in my RV, which is really a great deal more comfortable than staying in hotel rooms, as it is my home away from home. I must say I enjoy the versatility of being able to move around from job to job in my home on wheels, so to speak. It's incredibly comfortable as after a day's hard work, doing physically exhausting and grueling work, I'm certainly not up to travelling long distances, and even if I was, it would be impossible to get to work on time with the very early starts at the building site. Wherever possible, I do enjoy the privilege of living on the site, and most of my clients like the security and convenience of having someone on hand all the time. My strange, incredulous story began when I was asked to build a property in the Blue Ridge Mountain area, close to Ashe County. I'd been given the job to build the farmhouse through a highly esteemed architect friend of mine, whom recommended my services to the client, a lady called Mrs. Colbert. It would seem that Mrs. Colbert had purchased a great deal of land. She wanted to build her dream home for her family. She had also chosen the perfect spot for the location. The original 1800s federal-style farmhouse that still stood on the premises was being preserved. The family was still living in it while the building work progressed. But Mrs. Colbert was going to move her sister's family into the original farmhouse once the project was complete, and then her family would finally move into the brand new home that we were creating for her. Well, that was the plan anyway. I understood that Mrs. Colbert and her sister's family were exceptionally close and wanted to share the same piece of land. And why not if you can afford to? It was very much an exciting job, challenging and creative, and required skill and expertise. A knowledge of history and architectural plans specifically designed to complement the original federal-style architecture. I work with a team of very talented, skilled, expert builders, and everyone was exceedingly excited about the job at hand, as it was situated on a vast acreage of land, surrounded by exquisite panoramic mountain views, sculptural rugged outcrops, pretty open prairies, vast areas of natural ubiquitous woodland, silvery ponds, enchanting creeks, and a glorious stream that meandered through the heart of the wood green. I had been given permission by the kindly Mrs. Colbert to park my RV on her land and live in this idyllic spot while the building project commenced, and I was happy about the prospect of manning the fort and enjoying the benefits of the pretty open countryside, fresh mountain air and mesmerising views while I was at it. And so began the challenging but awe-inspiring building project, with bulldozers and hydraulic excavators to create trenches, holes and foundations. We created a very sizable clearing of flattened land, and to the rear of the property, several hundred yards from where we planned to build a large wraparound porch, was a very pretty pond that was flanked by cascading willows and then stretched out to a vast resplendent-looking sylvan. Mrs. Colbert liked the idea of drinking pina coladas with her family while watching and observing the indigenous wildlife that frequented the pond for an early morning drink. She was a passionate animal lover and was particularly fond of deer. And she also loved interesting bird life, most particularly birds of prey like ospreys and eagles. The moment we began digging, I sensed we were being watched by unseen eyes, but this was not the first time I'd experienced such unusual phenomenon. Once on a building project in North Carolina, we had endured similar things, where unearthly, eerie paranormal phenomena were perceived. We certainly sensed the whole time that invisible eyes were studying us, which had always been very discomposing for us. We would hear strange apparitional talking that could never be discerned, as the phantom-like voices seemed muffled and far away. But sometimes we would hear our names being called, and that would invariably freak us all out and send chilling shivers down our spines, and some of my workmen had bailed on me, as they were so traumatized by these spine-chilling events. If that wasn't hauntingly unsettling enough for you, some of us were even physically touched by invisible hands. But when we invariably turned around to see who'd tapped us, no one was standing there. So I was feeling more than a little creeped out, especially by the familiarity of harrowing memories from a building job that I would so much sooner forget. I pushed those thoughts back to one side and told myself to stop indulging my imagination with these crazy ideas, and to focus on the job at hand. Yet despite my very best efforts, I failed to relinquish the spooky feeling that I was being watched. When I glanced towards the sylvan very briefly, I was almost certain that I had detected the silhouette of a dark shadow peering at me from behind a tree. Now I was really getting carried away in my imagination, I thought very angrily to myself. Suddenly Sid, who was managing the hydraulic excavator, stepped off the machine for a moment, saying that he had spotted something buried beneath the ground, and that was when we realised we'd dug up an old gravesite. We had unearthed the body of a massive giant humanoid skeleton that was exceptionally large and much bigger than a human's, with very long leg bones and a thick conical skull that was full of very sizable teeth, far larger than your average man. I heaved a huge sigh of deep frustration. This was a massive setback because we would have to call the sheriff out in case there was anything nefarious or underhanded about our discovery. This had the potential to hold back our building project for weeks or even months on end, especially if the area was deemed to be a crime scene. I asked Sid, who was a man of few words, to call out the sheriff for us. We all stood over the gravesite, staring at the body in disbelief, or rather the skeleton, should I say, wondering if we were about to unearth some more nasty, insidious surprises from beneath the earth. Suddenly we saw this massive boulder, and when I say massive, I mean massive. It was easily about 5 foot wide, 6 foot tall, and incredibly heavy, and it was rolling down the valley at a very fast speed, and all three of us on the site automatically ran to stop it, because it was tumbling towards my RV and could have potentially caused a great deal of damage. Luckily, the rock did stop, and it failed to move any further and was positioned several yards away from my parked RV, or mobile home if you like. Robin just gawked in astonishment and said, "What the heck? How in God's name could something like this happen? It defies rational explanation." We were amazed by this extraordinary event because to push something this large and this heavy would take brute, almost superhuman strength. Where on earth had the boulder come from? And who on earth had pushed it? I looked towards the wood green to see if I could see anything or anyone standing there, but there was nothing in sight. Everything was very still. "Someone or something must have pushed this massive stone," said Sid, looking flummoxed. "And where did it come from?" All of us looked at the woods to see if we could see any more signs of movement, but everything was suddenly so airily still it actually sent shivers down my spine, and my hair was standing on edge. I felt as if something was not quite right deep in my gut, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. "Something is definitely watching us," piped Robin, looking at me with wide eyes. "Please to God may this not be another building development that stirs up malevolent spirits. I don't think I could go through that all over again. Last time it happened, I literally needed trauma counselling." Feeling emotionally dishevelled and somewhat disturbed by the curious incongruous sequence of events that had just transpired, with perplexed feelings of bewilderment, we finally returned back to the gravesite, and to our absolute amazement and utter horror, the bones had seemingly just vanished and disappeared into thin air. I mean, how does that happen? I had no comprehension of what had just transpired and began to think it was something paranormal that was out of our realm of understanding. I mean, I couldn't put it down to anything else, as it didn't make any logical sense at all. How could a gargantuan boulder come thundering down at a hill at such a fast speed, all on its own accord? And how on earth did a skeleton just totally dissipate into thin air, no longer to be visibly seen? When the sheriff arrived, I was heartily relieved to discover that Sid, my builder, who had a vocabulary of only a few words, had lived up to his reticent, evasive reputation. It appeared that on his telephone call to the sheriff's office, he had been very vague, indefinite and inexplicit, informing the sheriff to get to the building site at Fairfields at once, leaving the sheriff high and dry and not even clear about who had actually called him. This was exceedingly fortunate as far as I was concerned. It meant that I didn't have to mention the skeleton that we had uncovered that had vanished before our eyes. I can only imagine how crazy we would have sounded at such a peculiar revelation. "What's up?" said the sheriff, getting out of his car and closing the door behind him. "I received a call to come out here." "Really?" I said, acting very surprised. "Did anyone around here call the sheriff?" I said, looking around with shark eyes that clearly said, "Don't say anything, or I might just bite." We all shook our heads in unison. "Nope, sorry, Sheriff, we never did call you out." The ample-sized, well-rounded sheriff stroked his grey wispy moustache pensively, in an introspective way, almost as if he was deeply engrossed in his own thoughts on the matter. He shook his head, looking ever so frustrated and rather put out. "Kids," he said. "Who would have them? Always up to their crafty little tricks during the school holidays, phoning me up to get me running around the place like a headless chicken. For some reason they think it's terribly funny to keep calling me out on these fake emergencies. I think I've a pretty good idea who the scheming little culprit is. The boy's mother needs to teach her son some manners and to send her kid to summer camp, to get some sense knocked into that harebrained head of his. He spends his time getting up to all kinds of trouble in the holidays, with nothing better to do with his time. If that mother doesn't watch him, he'll end up in jail one of these days, the little bugger. You know the saying, the devil makes time for idle hands." "You must be right, Sheriff," I agreed. "I'm sure it was that kid just winding you up and having a laugh at your expense." We breathed a sigh of relief as we watched the sheriff get back into his car and drive away. I could see that he looked less than amused, and sneakily suspected that he'd been called out on a donut break, and was less than thrilled to be summoned away from the sweet, delectable treats that he'd been looking forward to enjoying with a piping hot cup of coffee this morning. "Whew, that was close," sighed Robin. "Well, at least the disappearing skeleton means that we can pretend we never saw it, and get on with the building. And so invariably, that is exactly what we did. 2 months passed and things were going exceedingly well on the building project, and we were way ahead of schedule and had long since forgotten the incident with the skeleton, as since its mysterious erroneous disappearance, the strange feelings we'd once experienced of feeling watched had long since dissipated and been forgotten. It would seem that we were no longer being blighted or hampered by paranormal events, which was a monumental relief for the all of us. One afternoon when we finished work early, I decided to take a light stroll into the Sylvan, and Robin agreed to join me. It was a lovely day. We took an ice bucket with us containing ice-cold beers and a few sandwiches. We ambled into the wood green, as Mrs. Colbert had told us that the stream in there is so beautiful and was an exquisite spot to enjoy a picnic. As we walked through this bewitching, beguiling treed oasis, I really began to regret that I hadn't explored the spot before, because it was so magical and was almost as if we'd stepped into an epic, whimsical, enchanting fairy tale world that was as pretty as a picture. The trees were tall, towering, statuesque giants, many with remarkable gargantuan trunks that were covered in carpets of velvety green moss. And the canopy above our heads was like an exquisite parasol, and it allowed just enough shafts of sunlight to dance through the branches, dappling the forest floor in various shades of speckled light. The forest floor was covered with pretty ferns and moss-covered boulders, and there was a few shade-loving flowers splashing the valley in kaleidoscopes of pretty colours. We could hear the soothing sounds of the water cascading down the rocky outcrops, and we could also hear the chirps and warbles of the uplifting bird song. We ventured towards the stream, and marvelled at the waterfall that jetted down this craggy, rugged outcrop with torrential floods of white water that flowed into the beautiful brook. Robin and I found a vast area of smoothed-out, flattened rocky crag that overlapped and jutted over the edges of the stream, much like a vast table ledge, and it was the quintessential spot to spread out our sumptuous picnic whilst enjoying the bedazzling views over this idyllic flowing watercourse. We hungrily ate our delicious tuna sandwiches and downed our beers thirstily. None of us said a thing, as indeed no words needed to be spoken. I think we were both equally transfixed and mesmerised by the exquisite beauty of this pretentious, legendary place. All of a sudden I heard a thumping sound, and the only way I can describe that sound to you is it was rather like something was hitting a tree very hard, almost like the knocking of a hammer being pounded against wood. Everything became very still for a moment, and that was when we heard this very heightened buzzing noise that became alarmingly intense. That was when we observed these two massive dark hairy silhouettes that at first glance seemed to look rather like bears sprinting towards the stream at lightning speed with 5-foot strides on powerfully strong legs. They were being aggressively assaulted by an angry cloud of black buzzing bees that had launched a full-blown frenzied attack on the two critters. These curious-looking creatures dived beneath the water's surface, and many of the frenetic, feverish bees that I noted were attached to their long black shaggy coats in a large sea of buzzy movement was now drowned in the water, while others flying in the air seemed to suddenly disperse and scatter as the two dark figures just suddenly disappeared and vanished from sight. The hysterical, excitable bees quieted down considerably, but still seemed rather confused because there were no more targets to attack. For a while everything became calm, peaceful and quiet, and I couldn't see anything at all, as the cloud of bees just disappeared, rather like a shadow of dark speckled smoke. It would seem that the tranquil gushing water hushed as everything became deathly still. After about 3 to 5 long minutes, 2 drenched heads popped out from under the water, where they had successfully held their breaths for quite some time. They began to make some excitable whooping sounds and were splashing around in the water exuberantly. It was clear that they were very happy about something. Then one of the critters climbed out of the stream very quickly to return only moments later with a massive honeycomb in his hands, and both the creatures sat in the shallow end of the stream eating honeycomb in the water together. I realised that these two critters had been raiding a nest of wild bees, and although they were covered with hair, there were vulnerable areas on their skin, most especially their face, knees and sides of the torso under the arm area where the hair was less dense, that appeared to have developed some bumpy inflamed patches from the attack of the stinging bees. Nevertheless, they seemed unfazed and undaunted by the harrowing experience that they had just been through. These critters began to make the most orgasmic sounds as they enjoyed the honey. They looked like they were in heaven eating the sweet nectar, which dribbled down their faces and onto their hands, and I watched in awe as they licked the honey off their thick sausage-sized fingers. In all my born days, I don't believe that I've ever observed anything eat something with such gusto and relish. I think advertisers for honey products would hire them on the spot to advertise their honey, because I remember thinking to myself, boy, does that honey look good. "Oh my God," said Robin, looking at me in amazement. "I think they're Bigfoot." The words hit me like a punch in the guts, because my little daughter was passionate about Bigfoot, and I had assured her not to believe the spurious accounts on television. I told her that they were all make-believe, as Bigfoot was indeed not real. My wife had chastised me considerably and told me off for spoiling my child's whimsical belief in the hairy critter. "She wants to believe he's real. Don't spoil her fun. You really are a wet blanket," she told me. "You have no memory of what it's like to be a child. Let them dream, for goodness sake." Now here I was eating humble pie because I became horrifyingly aware that Bigfoot was indeed real. I was so stunned by this extraordinary revelation that I believe my fear was hijacked by shock, as seeing something you don't believe exists in our reality is very difficult to get your head around. Robin and I quickly took cover behind a rocky outcrop while we continued to watch the Bigfoot, who were completely oblivious to our presence, I'm glad to say. The two critters must have been about 7 foot tall and about 6 to 100 pounds, with very lean muscular legs and overlong arms. Their torsos were stocky and solidly built, and the size of their shoulders were very gargantuan. They were covered in long, flowy, sandy-coloured hair, and their heads were the shape of pyramids that seemed to fold into the shoulders in a sweeping flow, with no evidence of a neck to speak of. The hairless, leathery, olive-skinned faces were long, and the jawline square with a prominent, distinguished brow ridge, flat nose, thin mouth, and very deep-set golden brown eyes. I can see why people describe Bigfoot as an ape-like humanoid, as I'm certain he does possess human and ape DNA. But I'm not an expert in these matters, nor do I claim to be. I'm not sure if I was correct, but I was pretty certain that the Bigfoots that we observed were actually quite young. I got that impression by their jubilant, youthful, mischievous energy, but I could of course be wrong. I did discern that they were taking their time to eat the honey, as they wanted to savour every single mouthful, and I thought that showed great intelligence and discernment on their part. There was no rush for them to gobble it all up at once, and they were eager to take their time. The critters sat in the shallow water for ages, rather like my wife does when she eats mangoes in the bath to avoid getting the sticky juices all over her. Maybe that's what the Bigfoots were trying to do. All I know is that Robin and I were so transfixed and amazed by what we were observing that we barely noticed the sun setting and the darkness rolling across the valley, and that was when I realised it was getting dark and late. The critters were still playing in the water together when we sneaked away and left them. Luckily we managed to make our way back to my RV, where I persuaded Robin to sleep in my spare bed. I just knew that I wanted to talk the whole night about what we'd seen and perceived. I couldn't share my experience with anybody else, so he was the one I wanted to talk to about it. Who else would ever believe our story? As Robin and I began to talk, we both reflected back to the very first day that we had found the large skeleton in the ground, and we began to put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together, and got a clear picture of what really had happened. We are both absolutely certain that the skeleton we found buried beneath the ground was not human at all, but rather that of a large Bigfoot, based on the elongated skull shape and the size of the skeleton. We had sensed that something had been watching us when we began bulldozing the area. I now believe emphatically it was a worried family of Bigfoot that were highly concerned we were digging up the remains of a long-lost relative. As a result, they created a diversion by rolling a massive boulder towards my RV, so that all my builders were distracted by the incident and diverted from the gravesite. It would seem that Bigfoot had rescued the bones from the ground while we were momentarily distracted. They possibly reburied those bones somewhere else. Robin and I were now certain that this is what had transpired. We were in awe at the intelligence of these creatures who are so successful at remaining elusive, evasive and invisible. We had watched them on this afternoon successfully recover a large honeycomb from a bunch of frenzied bees. My guess is that they'll possibly keep going back for more, as I very much doubt they destroyed the whole nest. They're too clever for that. Robin and I also marvelled that we hadn't actually been scared the whole time. We most certainly should have been, but it would be hard to imagine the joyful critters becoming aggressive towards us, as they were so high on sugar. Robin informs me that when his wife gets very grumpy, he will buy her something very rich and sweet and sticky, much like a chocolate brownie, and he says it works like a charm every time in putting his wife into a good jovial mood. No wonder they say that sugar is as addictive as cocaine. I think possibly we sensed the Bigfoots were no threat to us based on their good mood, but maybe things would have been remarkably different for us if we had faced Bigfoot on a rather bad day when his stomach was empty. I know if I haven't eaten, I get very grouchy, but once my belly is full, I'm one happy man. Could Bigfoot be as predisposed towards mood changes as much as we are, that could ultimately affect the kind of encounter we might have with the critter should our paths cross? After our project was finished, I always reflected on the Bigfoots we saw that day. Robin and I get together from time to time to discuss it, but until now we've not shared our story with anybody else. He did give me permission to share my story with you, though. I did, however, tell my daughter once that I believe Bigfoot might be real after all. My daughter was incredibly delighted, and my wife even gave me a hug. "That's much more like it," she said. "I do like it when you humour the kids. It's a very nice thing to let your children dream, you know." So there you are. That's my story. My word! Who would have thought that Bigfoot would have had such a sweet tooth and want to go after the honey? He's more clever than we think. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Matthew and I'm from Seattle in Washington, and my remarkable, incredulous story began shortly after my great-uncle Huck passed away of a heart attack. This was on his small cattle ranch east of the Cascades in Washington. It would appear that he had left his sizable estate to my father in his will, which included his small cattle ranch. This all happened in 2011, when I was about 11 years old at the time. This prodigious gesture of extravagant generosity on my great-uncle's part surprised my dad, as he had never expressed an interest in raising cattle before, and he'd only ever visited the ranch a handful of times as a young boy to play with his cousin Donovan. Very sadly, Donovan's mother had died of bowel cancer when he was only 8 years old, and so Donovan grew up to be his father's blue-eyed boy. Unfortunately, Donovan, my great-uncle's only son, should have inherited the cattle ranch from his dad, but had tragically been killed in a horse-riding accident 5 years prior when he went flying off a horse and crashing and colliding onto a rocky ridge. After his tragic death, as you can imagine, my great-uncle was never really the same again, because a deep depression hung over his life like an oppressive dark thundercloud. He sought solace and comfort from the lonely emptiness he regularly experienced by talking to his cows, because they never answered him back, and he always felt in some bizarre way that they almost commiserated with him over the compounding grief that he suffered in his life. According to a good friend of Huck's, he really believed that his cows understood him. So it was that my family made the decision to move to the ranch for the summer holidays. That was to decide what was to be done about the place, as selling up seemed almost unthinkable, given how much blood, sweat and tears that my great-uncle had invested in the place over the years. I remember that momentous, memorable day as if it was yesterday. That was the day that I first laid eyes on this heavenly ranch, and it was just so breathtakingly beautiful to behold. I couldn't believe it. There were open pastures for rotational feeding, and there were mountainous valleys, rugged outcrops and pretty little country roads. There was a sparkling silvery lake that was flanked by a dreamy statuesque forest of mature imposing trees that had been superbly preserved by my great-uncle. It was so incredible that this outstanding impressive property was all ours, and my shaggy golden retriever sensed that. Lassie was literally over the moon about this brand new, exciting adventure of ours. I laughed as I watched her darting everywhere, smelling every available piece of turf, and lifting her leg on everything that she could possibly mark. It was as if she was saying, "Watch out, I'm in Eastern Washington, and get used to it, because I'm making my presence known, and I'm marking my new auspicious territory." Lassie also adored swimming in the lake, while I would throw sticks for her to catch, and I could tell that if Lassie had her way, she would gladly make the cattle ranch her brand new home. And much to my amazement, she had even managed to befriend the cows. The grand ranch-style home with its grey roof and whitewashed walls was exceedingly attractive and in a very good state of repair. It was a quintessential two-storey home with all the bedrooms situated upstairs and the first floor devoted to open-plan living, where the kitchen seamlessly blended into the living and dining quarters of the home without any restrictive partitions, which meant that the whole dwelling was both sumptuous, cosy, spacious, airy and light. There were gorgeous large stone fireplaces in the living area, comfortable family-sized couches scattered with pretty colourful cushions, glass coffee tables layered with interesting-looking books, and a very large oak dresser superbly displayed with blue and white Royal Doulton china plates and accessories, giving the whole space a shabby chic kind of look. There were large stylish windows along the front of the house, as well as seamless glass sliding doors that pulled back to reveal a generously sized covered patio area that overlooked magnificent panoramic views over the evergreen trees that flanked the sparkling jewel-like lake. It would seem that no expense had been spared on kitting out the patio with state-of-the-art barbecue equipment, not to mention a fridge and a bar, and even a pizza oven, if that wasn't enough. "It's so beautiful," gasped my mother. "I'd love to live here permanently." "Not so fast, honey," said my father, kissing her on the cheek. "I don't know the first thing about running a ranch, and frankly I'm not sure if I'm cut out for the job. It looks dauntingly overwhelming for me." "Don't be so hard on yourself, dear," said my mother. "You can turn your hand to anything and make it work. I know you could." At that moment there was a knock at the door, and standing in the doorway was a rather stylish-looking older gentleman. He was wearing a cowboy hat and boots, along with a pair of Levi jeans, with a zooty leather belt, adorned with an oversized, rather ornate-looking buckle that was embossed with an engraving of a large bull upon it. He was wearing a stylish, rather debonair white cotton shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows. In my opinion, he bore a striking, uncanny resemblance to Clint Eastwood, with the whole cowboy look going on. The slender, athletic, strong body, the rugged, weathered complexion, and the white hair. "Howdy there," he said. "I'm Abel, and I was Huck's farmhand. I'm dreadfully sorry for your loss," he said, reaching out to shake all of our hands. "So lovely to meet you," my mother interjected. "We're going to need all your help running this ranch. We've not got the first clue how to get started." "That's what I'm here for," he said. "I know all of the ropes, so I'll teach you everything you need to know about the cows. Must have been a big shock for you, inheriting the ranch out of the blue like this, with all the cows, chickens and horses to boot. It's tough for city folks to get the hang of the country, but you'll learn quickly enough. That's a promise." "Oh, believe me, I'm going to need all the help I can get," said my father. "I'm still trying to get my head around it all." "Luckily he didn't suffer," said Abel, as he began to talk about my great-uncle. "He was out there feeding the cows, and then I saw him fall over, and he was a goner, just like that. Died the way he wanted to go, with his beloved cows. He loved those animals like they were his children, you know." "Well, that's a good thing," said my mother. "I mean that he died so peacefully." "He knew he was going to die," said Huck reflectively. "I thought he was talking baloney at the time, when he told me to look after this place and his cows for him, when he was gone. Naturally, I asked him what the heck he was on about, because he was so healthy at the time. He said he'd seen a vision of his son Donovan in a dream, you know. His son was riding on horseback under the sun towards the rocky ridge where he actually had that terrible accident. And he said, 'Dad, I'm coming to get you soon,' and then cantered away on his horse. He believed the dream because he said it was that vivid. Not like other dreams, he told me." "Wow," said my father. "That's extraordinary. It's almost like a premonition." "You could say that," said Abel. "There were a few strange things happening around here over the years, but that's a whole other story. I do need to inform you, though, that we have been having a few problems with wolves trying to attack cows in the area, although fingers crossed it hasn't happened here on our ranch yet." From what I gather, Fish and Game are not much of a help either, as they seem much more intent with saving the wolves and not our cows, which is a hell of a shame if you ask me. I mean, the cows are our livelihoods around here. What are you going to do about it? Asked my father in horror. Well, I keep the cows enclosed in the rotational pasture land for their own protection, so they're not free to wander as they please. The problem is that the pole fences won't stop the wolves from getting into the cows, but at least they're contained, so we can be alerted if they're attacked. Some of the big ranches in the area have lost cows to these sporadic wolf attacks, and they've been getting worse lately. It seems that the wolves aren't even scared of the humans, so it's an increasing worry for all the ranch owners out here. Anyway, I'll leave you to get settled in, he said, lifting his cowboy hat off his head very briefly in a gesture of friendliness and walking away. Wolves, said my father. Who would have thought they'd be a problem on a cattle ranch? I hope they stay away from here, because I'm not sure I could handle fighting off creatures like that on a ranch. Maybe they're breeding too much, I suggested, especially if they're being protected. Good point, son, said my father. Too much of anything causes problems, like too many hogs cause environmental damage. And even though I like wolves, it seems they're getting out of hand in the area, and I hope Fish and Game do something about it, and just don't sit on their laurels and do nothing. Before long, my family settled down and adapted to ranch life quite happily, and we really began to enjoy our whole new experience of living here on the ranch. I was helping my dad with the cattle, and I really warmed to the creatures, because believe it or not, cows are really rather nice. I even caught my father talking to them once, so I think he was beginning to appreciate the great outdoors, but was very reluctant to admit it. I'd also been riding with Abel over the ravishing, beautiful countryside, and he'd been teaching me all the ropes on how to run a cattle ranch smoothly. I would spend ages with Abel riding on the back of my horse, feeling its hooves trotting along the country lanes or the grassy turf beneath me, and enjoying the feeling of the gentle breeze blowing against my face, as well as taking in all these gorgeous panoramic views of the countryside like a delicious sweet nectar. The garrulous Abel told me so many stories about my great-uncle that were so fascinating that I hung on to his every word. As we were trotting along a country road with Lassie, my golden retriever, tottering behind us with her bushy tail wagging profusely, Abel began to tell me the most extraordinary story that I'd ever heard. One time, he continued, we found 2 dead bodies over there in the woods, he said, pointing to the wooded area that flanked the pristine-looking silvery lake that gleamed in the mid-morning sun and reflected the trees and fluffy clouds on its surfaces like a mirror. What? I gasped. Human bodies? They were human, all right, clearly trespassing on our land, but the bodies had been killed, mutilated and mauled in a very despicable fashion. When did this happen? I asked. Oh, that was about 30 good years ago, he said. How were they killed? Well, their heads had been brutally and violently twisted off their necks, much like a chicken head, and the eyes had been removed from the hollowed sockets, and the arms had been literally ripped off the bodies. Let me assure you, it was the most ghastly, grisly, catastrophic, and most gruesome sight that I have ever witnessed in my entire life. It was horrifying, he said. It would have taken something monstrously big to tear off a human limb like that, much like you or I tearing off a cooked piece of turkey breast away from the carcass. It was like that. But who could have done such a heinous, appalling thing? I asked. Well, your uncle was convinced it was a Bigfoot, although at the time no one knew what a Bigfoot was, so Huck kept his mouth firmly sealed, because he knew people would think he was absolutely loopy if he suggested a hairy humanoid ape was responsible for the erroneous, bizarre deaths. You see, Abel continued, the authorities believed it was a bear attack. Now, I assure you, a bear doesn't kill a human being like that, and they know it. The only thing it could have been was a Bigfoot. It couldn't have been anything else. A Bigfoot? I asked, looking dumbfounded. But are those things even real? Oh, they're real, all right, snapped Abel. Your uncle saw one in those woods over there, shortly before the harrowing, deadly incident occurred. I believed him. Your uncle never told a pork pie a day in his life, let me tell you. I remember it was on a Sunday morning when your great-uncle took his German long-haired pointers Biscuit and Poppy for a lazy ramble in the woods. He said his dog suddenly became incredibly enthused, excited and energized and began to bark continually at something that your uncle couldn't actually see. Whatever they were barking at was something that was very pleasing to them. Then your great-uncle suddenly saw a movement in his peripheral vision that looked like a shadowy form in the undergrowth. Once the creature knew it had been seen, it rose from its crouched position and stood up on its two powerful long legs, shielding half of his Herculean-sized body behind a tree trunk, with one overlong arm wrapped around it. Huck said the creature just stared at him with those bright golden eyes, and he said he was so unsettled because it was as if the creature was literally looking through his soul. He said that his heart began to pound violently in his chest like a heavy drum, and it was so thunderously hard he could actually hear it. He said he was so paralysed by fear because this thing was colossal and was covered in shaggy dark brown hair. At the time, your great-uncle did not know what on earth it was and described it as a giant humanoid ape. Was it aggressive towards him, I asked. No, not at all. That's the absurd thing, said Ape. The critter seemed gentle and rather curious, and even his German pointers seemed unusually gregarious and good-natured towards the critter, which was the most peculiar thing of all. It was as if they were familiar and well acquainted with the beast. Biscuit literally bounded over to the hairy critter and jumped up and down on him like he was welcoming an old friend, and the critter patted the dog affectionately, almost as if he knew him well. Now those dogs slept outside watching the cows at night, so maybe they had met the curious critter before. Your uncle reprimanded Biscuit severely and told him to get back here. Those dogs were incredibly obedient and loved the bones off your great-uncle, but they seemed reluctant and hesitant to say goodbye to their hairy friend, whom let's just say they appeared to really like. Your uncle ran as fast as he possibly could back to the house because he was so terrified. He told me it was the toughest, most grueling and challenging run of his entire life because his legs failed to cooperate and felt like blocks of cement beneath him. I remember him telling me that his adrenaline that had been coursing through his veins had been of no use whatsoever to him in increasing his speed because his running had been laborious and laboured, almost as if he was treading water. He was so scared he looked as white as a ghost and his eyes were as wide as saucers, and he said, "Abel, I've just seen a colossal monster in the woods, and can you believe it? My dogs actually liked the thing." Well, I asked, if the creature was as gentle as you say, why did Great-Uncle Huck believe the Bigfoot murdered those people in such a barbaric way? Huck was certain no one else could have perpetrated that grisly crime. It was the way they were killed, you see. Who else could have possibly killed those people like that? Who has the strength to twist a human neck like a chicken? Did they ever find out the identities of those trespassers that were killed? I asked curiously. Well, yes. That was where the story gets interesting, because the authorities discovered that many missing cows had mysteriously vanished in the area, had actually been stolen by these two men. So your great-uncle was convinced those men were scouting his ranch with nefarious motives, with the full intention of stealing a few cows. It would make sense because they were carrying rifles and binoculars at the time, including a notebook that contained timetables of detailing the movements on our farm. After that startling revelation, Huck felt a lot less sympathetic towards the two dead men who had lost their lives so treacherously and in such a gruesome way. You see, those cows were his life, so you don't mess with a rancher's cows. Ask any rancher about that. They take it very personally, you know. Could the Bigfoot have possibly been protecting the cows, I suggested. Maybe he sensed that the men were up to no good. Your Uncle Huck came to the very same conclusion and began to believe that the Bigfoot was territorial and protective towards the ranch and its animals. So actually he warmed to the Bigfoot but never saw it again because they're very elusive creatures by nature. That's why they're not rarely documented by science. Wow, I said, that's some story. Little was I to realise at the time that I would have a story all of my own to tell that was also extraordinary. It all happened when my golden retriever Lassie, that sleeps at my feet, began to growl furiously at the end of my bed one night. I noticed that her ears were pinned right back, and her tail was thumping and hanging between her legs. I immediately knew something was very wrong, and the first thing I thought about was the safety of the cattle, and so I quickly grabbed my dad's hunting rifle and raced out of the front door as fast as I could towards the pasture where the cows were grazing. Sure enough, I could see that the cattle were terribly flustered. They were mooing earnestly, and there were several grey wolves stealthily moving in on one of the smaller cows as they hankered beneath the poled fencing and crept cautiously closer and closer to their intended victim. To my absolute horror, Lassie bounded towards the wolves and started barking at them fearlessly. But she was outnumbered by these creatures, and then they circulated her and began to growl, and one leapt forward and lunged over my dog, pinning her onto the ground. That was my worst nightmare, unravelling before my very eyes. I was about to lose my precious dog. Everything seemed to be happening in slow motion, and every second seemed to last a lifetime. My heart was pounding violently in my chest, and my fingers were clumsily trying to straighten my rifle to aim at the wolf. But I was so terrified of shooting my dog by mistake. Suddenly I saw him emerging out of the shadows, and to my amazement it was a Bigfoot. I could hardly believe it. I was so stunned. This creature was as fast as greased lightning, and he came to my dog's rescue in a miraculous second. I promise you his movements were so swift that an unloaded bullet from a rifle would fail to compete. He bounded towards the wolf, and his mouth curled back to reveal a large set of human teeth, and he unleashed the most horrifying roar that was so thunderous and so terrifying it caused the ground to shake and wobble beneath me. My whole body literally trembled with terror. In a trice this creature had lifted the wolf that was on top of Lassie and tossed it into the air like a frisbee, where it landed on the ground with a heavy thump. He twisted its neck so violently that the head was turned to face the opposite direction, which looked seriously macabre. I promise you, this wolf looked like a tiny puppy in the gargantuan hands of the monstrous beast. The wolves were so petrified they started to make whimpering sounds as they retreated backwards, watching their friend succumbing to its deadly fate. This Bigfoot grabbed another wolf and killed it with the same violent momentum and deadly sequence, and the rest of the wolf pack fled away in absolute terror, making some strange whimpering sounds, with their hair on their coats quite literally doubling in size, much like a cat's does when it's frightened. It was extraordinary. Lassie came bounding towards me, so delighted to have been rescued, because she knew her life had been spared. I couldn't believe that she barely had a scratch on her. I knew if the Bigfoot hadn't reacted so swiftly, Lassie would most certainly have been dead. Once the wolves had gone, the Bigfoot looked at me for a moment, and his golden eyes seemed both congenial and very warm. I nodded to the Bigfoot and said thank you, and I know this sounds weird, but I'm certain he understood me. I noticed the Bigfoot possessed the typical cone-shaped head that is so often described, and it seamlessly blended into his shoulders without any evidence of a neck. It was covered in long, shaggy grey hair, with areas of white, and his leathery skin on its oval worm-like face was very weathered and shriveled, and also quite wrinkled, and I really got the impression that this wizened creature was quite long in the tooth. To my amazement, Lassie assuredly went bounding up to the hairy creature, as she knew that it had indeed saved her life, and her gratitude was immense. The large hand of the Bigfoot cradled her head and gently stroked her body. I noticed that the critter was missing 2 fingers on one of his hands. I watched in astonishment as Lassie rubbed her body against the creature's strong, powerful legs, very affectionately, as if she was almost laying claim to him. I want to stress that Lassie is a devoted, doting and tender-hearted dog, but she can be wary and reticent of strangers, and is only friendly to those she trusts. It's rare for her to display such warmth to a complete stranger, so I was flabbergasted and rather astonished. I would say that this Bigfoot was easily 9 foot tall, 800 pounds and 3 foot wide, and was clearly built for power, speed and strength. Put it this way, he was intimidating and scary, but his powerful demeanour contradicted his foreboding appearance, and although he killed those wolves in such a savagely brutal way, in reality he was really a rather gentle giant, who was seemingly rather protective to both my dog and the cows, which was so commendable. I mean, who wouldn't want that? I noticed that while all this was transpiring, some rather interested, curious cows were watching everything that was occurring with wide, curious eyes and a very eager interest. They didn't seem afraid of the Bigfoot for some strange reason, which rather suggested to me that this was not their first encounter with the hairy humanoid, and that they weren't uncomfortable with his appearance at all. At this point, I'd like to mention that I never smelt that hot garbage smell that is often associated with a Bigfoot sighting. For me, the creature smelt a little like my wet dog, but that never offends me. Suddenly I heard my father walking towards the front door, and in that instant the Bigfoot threw both wolves, one over each shoulder, much like a big dangling furry scarf, and gracefully glided away at lightning speed, clearly not wanting to be observed by my father. "What's going on?" asked my dad. "I'm sure I heard some noises. Are the cows all right? It's not the wolves, is it?" he asked, looking apprehensive. He was half asleep, wearing his dressing gown and slippers, and looked very tired. "Why was Lassie barking so much?" he continued, "and making such a raucous commotion?" "Everything's fine," I assured him. I knew if I told my dad what had actually happened, he would have overreacted and might have chosen to sell my great-uncle's ranch, claiming that dealing with a Bigfoot and a bunch of wolves was far more than he could ever handle. I didn't want him to have the perfect excuse to concede defeat. My father was often quick to doubt himself, even though he was a man of many talents and accomplishments. My mother was always the one to make him see sense and give him a nudge in the right direction. I was enjoying living here so much on the cattle ranch. I was not going to tell him anything because I had a vested interest in staying here. I also felt so connected with the cows and the land. I had developed a deep longing in my heart to become a rancher one day, as this intriguing, idyllic, inspirational, wholesome lifestyle seemed as natural as breathing to me. The last thing I wanted was to return to our humdrum, monotonous, and seemingly dreary lives back in the city. Even my studious mother was loving life on the ranch, and my father just needed a little more persuading to convince him to jack in his tediously boring job in the city as a chartered accountant to become a fully fledged cattle rancher. You see, I was exceedingly confident knowing that that remarkable, protective and rather loyal Bigfoot was ensuring that both the cows and my dog Lassie were indeed in safe hands. I was to find out that I was very right, because many ranchers in the Washington area had ongoing wolf attacks on their cows, but it would seem the wolves have left ours alone, thanks to the Bigfoot that was always on patrol. When I confided in Abel about what had transpired that night, and how Bigfoot had miraculously rescued Lassie from the wolf attack, I mentioned that the hairy ape-like humanoid that I encountered was actually missing 2 digits on one of his hands. Imagine the surprise I got when Abel informed me that he had failed to mention that the Bigfoot my great-uncle Huck had observed was also missing 2 digits on his hands. So the Bigfoot had clearly lived on this land for over 30 years and had grown accustomed to the daily routines of ranch life. It would seem that the Bigfoot has succumbed to the ravages of age and the environmental hazards of a hard lifestyle, for over the years his dark brown hair has receded and grown grey. It would seem that this extraordinary critter really loves dogs and even cows that he watches over, and he succeeded in protecting them all. I ask you, what better guard could you possibly have? I've heard rather terrible stories about Bigfoots before, such as you cannot trust them and that they're exceedingly dangerous. I can't make any comments about other people's experiences, but only comment about mine. I can only ascertain that some are good and others bad. It's literally as straightforward as that, I imagine. Fast forward a few years, and the good news is that my father settled down to become a great cattle rancher, and can't even fathom how he stuck it out for so long behind a desk in a city office, because like me, he adores the fresh air and the sunshine. And boy, he is a good rancher, even if I say so myself. He told me once that my great-uncle had actually appeared to him in a dream and said, "Well done, son. I knew I could trust you to take care of my cows." My father said the dream seemed so real, and after that event his confidence in running the ranch literally skyrocketed. I've caught him on many occasions still having lengthy discussion with the cows over the oddities of life. As for the Bigfoot, I haven't actually seen him of late, but I know he's around. I can sense him. Recently I uncovered a few 16-inch tracks in the ground. Also at night I've often heard among the sounds of the crickets and frogs the occasional whooping sound. and my mother firmly believes it sounds like a primate. I shan't be telling her the truth, or how right she actually is. Sadly, Abel did die about 5 years ago, but I'm so thankful he taught me how to become a fine rancher. So there you are. That's my story. Thank you so much for that incredible story. What a territorial Bigfoot if I ever saw one.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Carly Fournier was attending to the weeds in her front yard that were sprouting through the red brick driveway with her kettle of boiling water. It was a nifty trick she'd picked up somewhere on a gardening website. She found this natural way of attacking the weeds successfully destroyed these uninvited rogue visitors that had trespassed so rudely in the tiny crevices between the brick paving. Their unsightly, ugly, unwelcome appearance always niggled her greatly. Carly wasn't obsessive-compulsive about anything in her life. On the contrary, she was relaxed, carefree, rather easy-going. But invasively aggressive weeds on a driveway bothered her sense of order like nothing else, and she went after her weeds with the aggression of a hive of bees being robbed of their honey. She knew her hang-ups about curb appeal were indelibly rooted in the past and hard to shake off, like the thorny briars snagged on a T-shirt after having walked through a thicket. She and her brother Larry had been raised in an upmarket Montreal neighbourhood, where the houses were pristine and magnificently beautiful. Many were high-end renovation projects that looked as if no expense had been spared. Windows gleamed without apology, with not even a smudge or smear mark in sight. Houses were freshly painted in crisp neutral colours, and yards were pristinely mown to perfection, displaying fabulous colourful flower beds, all summer and spring. The neighbourhood was proud, pompous, rather haughty, and appearances mattered for street cred in this part of Montreal. As is always the case, there was one house in the neighbourhood that invariably let the side down, and it was Carly Fournier's parents' house that wore an expression of gloom on its outer facade, and stuck out like a sore thumb in the neighbourhood. It looked abandoned, forsaken, forgotten, rather lost. The weeping walls looked more brown than white, and were practically begging for a new lick of paint, while burgeoning ivy was rambling around the house like verdant tentacles that wanted to strangle anything it touched. When Carly was young, she recalled having to snap the tenacious vines herself when they started to crawl through her bedroom window, and were threatening to lay down their sticky appendages across her internal walls. The once pristine pale green wooden shutters had faded to an off-cream colour, and the wood was beginning to become warped, as it hadn't been treated, and even the front door had buckled extensively, so you had to give it a huge shove to try and open it, as it was always getting stuck on its hinges due to the wood that had expanded and contracted from damp, cold, heat, and seasonal changes. The driveway had been overtaken by weeds and knee-high seeded grass, had confiscated the entire yard, and was tangled up with briars and ugly weeds. It looked so unkempt, so neglected, so untamed, as if the yard had a mind of its own and was doing what the hell it liked. It was hard to believe the house was actually occupied, for if you had driven down that street in that particular neighbourhood in Montreal, you would have assumed that the house must be abandoned, forsaken, unloved, and definitely unoccupied, and the locals would pretend as much, to explain away the embarrassment and eyesore on the street that left them all blushing with shame. Yet the truth was, behind the derelict, sad facade lived a family, a very loving family at that was possibly richer than most of the entire neighbourhood put together, with bank accounts practically hemorrhaging interest. But you would never have believed that for a moment, as why would any family overlook and forsake the general maintenance of their home? The Fourniers did not concern themselves with such mundane trivialities. Their attitude was, "I'll do it tomorrow." The Fourniers were possibly the laziest people you could ever hope to meet, for they loved nothing better than to lounge around on the sofa all day, reading novels, fabulous books, watching television, ordering takeout, smoking cigarettes, drinking beers, and enjoying long conversations about everything and nothing. Mr. Fournier was brilliant at television quizzes, and he'd hoot out all the answers with effortless ease. If he had been on a television game show,
He'd have walked away with the grand prize and the jackpot, but he was just too lazy to bother entering something like that. Mr. Fournier was often described as a walking Encyclopaedia Britannica, for he knew the strangest things. Despite the Fourniers' lackadaisical, slovenly approach to life, they were incredibly nice, genuinely warm people, funny, clever, and loving. But one of their less than redeeming qualities was they were both afflicted with the deadly disease of being bone idle, which meant doing the bare minimum was the preferable choice. The roof was lucky to escape without being damaged, because much like the rest of the house, it might have fallen apart, had it not been carefully attended to. But Carly's parents knew that a problematic roof could invite all kinds of issues into the house, like dry rot and mould, sinking ceilings, and other disasters. So thankfully they attended to that, but everything else they put on the back burner for another day, which invariably never came. Luckily the interior of the house was quite cosy, although inclined to become rather messy. Mr. Fournier, who was Carly and Larry's father, was like a big, fat, blubbery walrus with several chins and long white sideburns like white, narrow, hairy strips on either side of his face. Let's just say Mr. Fournier spent his days and nights parked on the sofa, watching sports games, reading all kinds of incredible books, and drinking beer as if he was dying of dehydration and had an insatiable thirst that could not be satisfied. Carly clandestinely privately thought that her father at times looked as dilapidated and time-worn as the house itself, as his long white ruffled hair looked like it had had an unfortunate run-in with a tornado, and had never seen a hairdresser's pruning shears a day in his life, something which he boasted about regularly with a great deal of pride, as if it was something to be proud of. "I'll have you know these fine locks of mine have not been attended to by a barber in years," he would say. Mr. Fournier would wear jogging pants with holes in them, and string vests in summer because they were comfortable and cool, as he didn't care a hoot about what he looked like, or what people actually thought of him, but he enjoyed being as comfortable as he possibly could, which was why he almost always wore slippers on his feet. In the winter every year, Mr. Fournier would wear an old Christmas sweater with a Santa Claus and his reindeer on it, long before and after Christmas was over, as he was very attached to the old beloved thing sentimentally, and it was a gift from his mother, and he wore it as often as he could to feel close to her. Suffice to say, Mrs. Fournier suffered from her husband's indolence, but perhaps her husband's lackadaisical ways had somehow inadvertently rubbed off on her, and she'd caught the lethargic infection. She would lounge casually in front of the television, listening to her favourite television programmes, with packets of sweeties balanced on her lap, and scoff the lot, littering the floor with a confetti of sweet wrappers. Her sugar addiction was fierce, and had consumed her life, but sugar can be more addictive than cocaine. Twice a week she would visit the old sweet shop in town, buying buckets of candy that she claimed were for kids' birthday parties, as admitting they were for herself made her feel rather bashful and self-conscious. She desired to do the bare minimum of housework, as she claimed she was far too tired, but with so much sugar circulating around in her bloodstream, her pancreas was probably overworked and very fatigued. The family did not live in squalor, but you might believe that based on the exterior of the home, with all its peeling paint and old roses that looked like they hadn't been pruned in many years. The grass was always unkept and the wooden windows buckling, clearly having seen better days. Carly and her brother would often return home to find her parents passed out on the couch, her father usually with a cigarette dangling out of the edge of his mouth and a beer can in his hand, while their mother looked like she'd been playing darts with sweet papers and would be snoring so loudly her mouth would hang open like a flycatcher. "Oh, you're back, sweetheart," her mother would say, suddenly opening her eyes, one after the other. "Would you be a love, darling, and put the kettle on for some tea? And maybe bring me some of those brownies that I bought at the baker's for us." The kids were used to doing things for their parents when they were parked on the sofa like two cars that had run out of gas and just could not move. Carly often wondered what it would have been like if her father had not inherited such a sizable, vast fortune. He might be forced to get off his lazy backside and do something for a living. Instead, he was living off the rich fruits he had inherited from his father, and it would seem he and his wife had no intentions of working a day in their lives if they could possibly help it. Let's just say on his deathbed, Chuck's own father had said to him, "I worry about leaving you all this money, Chuck. You're lazy by nature. Your wife ain't much better than you are. I'm concerned you'll never work again. You don't have any ambition, do you? That's not healthy. Too much money can do that to a man, and it's not good. Working gives you a reason to get up in the morning, a purpose. I found it did that for me." Even though his father considered leaving his wealth to his housekeeper, at the end of the day, blood was thicker than water, and he couldn't do it, even though he knew he was giving his son the license to never ever work again. And that is exactly what happened. His predictions came true. You would think the Fourniers had no excuse not to spend any money on their house, but they really couldn't be bothered. It was too much like hard work to organise a gardening team or some handyman to attend to their house, someone who might intrude on their peace and tranquillity, invading their privacy. Carly always pondered why on earth her father didn't want to attend to the lawn or get the shutters repaired and the walls repainted, why he wouldn't hire outside help like many people in the neighbourhood did. Carly's mother would sink into the couch and say, "Chuck, I think you need to attend to the lawn." He would raise an unkempt, white, bushy eyebrow, rub his chin reflectively and say, "Yes, the grass is rather long, isn't it? It could do with a good trim." "You could always get a gardener," his wife suggested. "I know the Brixtons have one that's very good. Then you wouldn't have to bother in doing it yourself." Carly's father had chuckled. "Ha ha! I told you, my cherub. I've got it all sorted. I'll do it tomorrow." The problem was tomorrow would never come. And even if it did, and Mr. Fournier made a start on the lawn, halfway through the project he would be sweating like a pig and abandon it for a break, and then never return to the job that he'd started, claiming he'd got far too hot, it was tediously boring, or he fancied a break. As a result, the lawn never got attended to, and sometimes a few anonymous, rather rude notes would appear on the Fourniers' front doorstep with comments like, "Your house is letting the street down. You should be utterly ashamed of yourself. What the hell is wrong with you? Have you no pride or self-respect? Or are you just far too poor and impoverished to live in this neighbourhood? If you are, then just bugger off. You're not wanted around here, nor are you welcome." Other notes would say, "Why the hell don't you people move? We don't want you here ruining the tone of our neighbourhood." On one occasion, someone in the street had sent a gardening team along to the Fourniers' house, free of charge, to clear up the yard and to mow their lawn for them. But Carly's parents took offence to such a brazen intrusion and sent the team away. Mr. Fournier had told the well-meaning young man, "Please leave. I've got my lawn under control. It's a bit long at the moment, and there are a few weeds, but I will get it sorted. I don't need you people interfering." "The bloody cheek of it," Carly's mother would say. "Some people just don't mind their own business, do they? I think we should get our grass to grow even longer, to get their backs up, don't you? That'll show them. The people in this neighbourhood are such snobs. It's insane." "Here's to that," said Carly's father. "Down with the snobs, I say." He raised a beer can to his mouth and took a jovial swig. Carly and her brother Larry were very embarrassed by the exterior of their home, so much so that they never invited people back to the property, because they were young and impressionable, and other people's opinions mattered to them. So they didn't inform their parents that there was a teachers' meeting in the evening after school, or a sports event that they were partaking in. They didn't want the other kids at school to laugh at the slovenly appearance of their parents. Carly would die of humiliation if her dad rocked up in his string vest and jogging pants to a teacher's evening, looking like something that the cat dragged in. And as for her mother, she always looked as if she'd been sleeping in her clothes for an entire week. They always appeared incredibly crumpled. The Fourniers did have regular friends, of course, visiting the house, who just knew an unkempt yard was typical of the Fourniers and never judged them for that. But people who knew them loved them dearly, as Mr. Fournier could make you laugh so much that you would leave the house feeling as if you'd really enjoyed yourself, as your belly would be aching so much from laughing. Mr. Fournier should have been a stand-up comedian, because he would never have disappointed his audience. It had been a tough childhood, growing up in a neighbourhood with a house that looked like a shack, amongst all these palatial, grandiose mansions in Montreal. Carly and her brother would leave home to walk to school when it was dark outside, usually bitterly cold, with an Arctic wind blowing against their skins. Their hands would be freezing through their woolly gloves, and they would be blowing out cold white mist from their nostrils. They would return home frozen to the bone, when it was still dark outside. You could forget their parents giving them a lift. They were probably lying passed out by a snug warm fire. One evening, it was so cold outside, and their much-loved cat Sylvia had been left out of doors by mistake all night. She'd been forgotten about. So when Carly opened the door the following morning, the poor cat's fur was frozen to the doorstep. You had to pull her away like Velcro from the step, and she was a sorry sight indeed, but luckily very much alive. Days later, Sylvia had moved into the house next door, where she'd found for herself a cushier lifestyle, where old Mrs. Garnier poached salmon for her every day. And better still, they had a cat flap fitted for Sylvia, which meant that she'd never be abandoned in the snow again. The next-door neighbour's yard was pristine, and better still, Mrs. Garnier had cat TV for Sylvia from the living-room window, as she would literally cover the bird table there with seeds and peanuts. And so for Sylvia, surrounded by the warmth of a wood-burning stove, curled up on a comfortable couch, she could observe all the bird life from the living-room window, without getting her paws remotely cold. Sylvia, of course, still loved the Fourniers very much, visiting them regularly, but she knew what side her bread was buttered, and Sylvia discerned that Mrs. Garnier could offer her a far more luxurious lifestyle. Even though Carly's parents were the quintessential couch potatoes that were married to sofa world, despite everything, they were remarkably good people, with kind hearts and great senses of humour. But they had no comprehension how much their children were affected by the shabby condition of their home, and had they known this, they would have gone to the ends of the earth to rectify things for their children. When Carly and her brother were older and much more responsible, Larry transformed the yard of their home, mowing it every week, planting beds of the most colourful, vibrant flowers, painting the house, restoring the tattered shutters, while Carly transformed the interiors of their home, making it comfortable and cosy. She taught herself how to cook. She prepared the family healthier meals. And then their house was no longer the embarrassment and shame of the street in Montreal. But one thing that remained ever the same was that Carly's parents were as lazy as ever, only ever leaving the house for a supermarket shop, to buy sweets from the store or ice cream from the parlour, or visit the occasional good friend. But beyond that, her parents were like two lovable hibernating bears, who thoroughly enjoyed remaining homebound all year round. It was hardly a wonder when Carly finally did leave home and got married, and she moved into a pretty Montreal neighbourhood with her husband Robert, that she was determined never to be that unsightly house on the street again, that everyone believed was abandoned and derelict. So on this unassuming day she was fastidiously attending to the weeds, and was unprepared for what was about to happen next, which was to put a spanner in the works and bring chaos to order, which was something that Carly could not abide. She had been fastidiously pouring this hot water over the weeds that peered at her tauntingly through the red brick paving, so the piping hot water caused the verdant leaves to shrink and curl up in disgust. She felt a measure of satisfaction to see them wilt like spinach in a steaming pot. "I've got you," she said with a sense of accomplishment. "You're not welcome to encroach on my driveway. Do you understand? Now get lost and die, will you?" The next thing she became aware of was a shadowy figure in her peripheral vision, wearing a glimmer of red that went rocketing past her. It was her 5-year-old son Oliver, riding his 2-wheel bike, cycling straight into the road with an unabashful confidence, clearly oblivious of the potential danger he was in. As he thought he was immortal, and accidents only ever happened in the movies, and when he smashed his toy cars into each other for fun on the oakwood floors in the lounge. "Oliver! Oliver!" she cried frantically, dashing after him. In her wedge flip-flops, she tripped over her feet. "Oliver! Come back! Oliver!" Carly's heart began to flutter violently in her chest like a frightened bird. Her twitching stomach churned and began to twist and contort. She feared the very worst as she ran helplessly down the long ribbon of asphalt, screaming after her son, who appeared to be tone-deaf or was wilfully ignoring her urgent pleas. She was consumed with a dreadful feeling of impending dread, as if she was anticipating something quite frightful was about to unfold. Oliver could be obstinate at the very best of times, delighting in being stubborn and causing his parents distress. He seemed to enjoy ruffling his parents' feathers. She scanned the street for oncoming traffic, sighing with relief when the neighbourhood looked peaceful and rather quiet. One woman on the sidewalk was walking her 2 black pugs, who were ambitiously sniffing the manicured green turf and leaving their signature scent marks on every available tree that they could find. One appeared to be doing a funny handstand while it peed. This quiet, prepossessing, elegant, historic street in Montreal was basking in the luxuriant memories of the past, wearing each day that transpired in the fabric of our world, as comfortably as the next, rather like a necklace of pearls around a woman's throat. The street was restfully enjoying yet another day, as it had done every other day before, wallowing blissfully in a congenial tranquillity, and was unflustered, unperturbed, and not concerned by the drama being birthed down the grey ribbon of asphalt, as Carly's shrieks rudely perforated the serene, salient ambience. The desperate, distorted, high-pitched screams echoed down the street, bouncing against the walls and windows of people's houses, who may have mistaken the sound for a goose flying above their homes, for they would often fly past the houses in great flocks, and Carly's screams were very similar to their shrieks. She frantically called after her son, the tone of her voice withered by trepidation, sharpened by angst. Thank God he was wearing his helmet. The little leaf European linden trees on either side of the road were flapping their branches wildly, like open umbrellas beating in the wind, as a breeze seemed to be blowing quite feistily on this pretty spring morning, while trinklets of pretty sunlight danced through the trees, casting soft shadows over the road. The lofty Gothic revival homes in the neighbourhood, with their elegant pointed arched windows, doors, dormers and gables, appeared to be reticently detached and composed, as if the entire street was sunbathing under the radiant prisms of light on this pleasant, unassuming morning. Then she heard it, before she saw it, the dreadful, discomposing, unsettling, high-frequency clunking and grinding sound of wheels accelerating on tarmac, getting closer and closer and closer as her son obliviously cycled down the road. It felt as if she was watching a horror movie with bated breath, anticipating what would come next. The strangled cries from within her failed to be articulated audibly, but as a mother, her scream seemed to echo through her entire body. Her heart swung like a pendulum, and every organ in her body jolted in anticipation. "Get off the road, Oliver!" she managed to scream, but it was all too late. The car, a red Honda Civic, brazenly came into view at the speed of a seagull, launching itself unsuspectingly towards someone's sandwich. The car was going way too fast to stop in time. Carly knew unequivocally that her son was going to collide with this car, and there was not a damn thing she could do about it. In that moment she was certain that she was witnessing the harrowing very last moments of her son's life. The car rammed into the side of his bicycle, throwing the bike off balance, so that the forward momentum meant her son was flung forwards on the handlebars and directly onto the sidewalk. She was cursing that her husband had taken the plastic training wheels off Oliver's bike, for he had whizzed down the road so fast, like the wind, without his speed being restrained or discouraged. By all accounts, there just had been no stopping him. She ran down the asphalt as fast as she possibly could, not caring about her own safety at all. None of that mattered. All she cared about was little Oliver. Her stomach was hollow with dread. She was inwardly screaming, but her fear had extinguished her voice like the light from a candle. The contorted bicycle lay buckled, distorted and crumpled by her son's side. His body appeared motionless and unmoving. The driver, unequivocally knowing what he had done, put his foot down on the accelerator, sped away like greased lightning, for the driver had no intention of being responsible for what he had done. Carly's heart was flapping a dime to a dozen as she finally reached her son. She dropped onto her hands and knees with an anguished expression on her face, feeling terrified of what she would find. She held her breath until her worst fears were confirmed. Oliver lay there, seemingly lifeless, like a rag doll. His helmet badly buckled, his eyes almost glazed over like a dead fish, his leg lying at an odd angle. She screamed. She knew her son was dead. There was no doubt about it in her mind. Her body trembled and shook like a blancmange jelly that could not be stilled. Her skin grew white. Her scream perforated the quiet, still street with its shrill resonance. But still, nobody realized it was a woman who was screaming. The kind of sound could cause glass to shake, windows to rattle. Then, against all the odds, Oliver, with a mischievous, naughty twinkle in his green eyes, sat up with a sudden jolt and a huge, cheeky grin on his face. "I got you, Mummy! You should have seen your face! You thought I was dead! The other day we played dead at school and everybody said I was the most convincing dead person that they've ever seen. You thought I was dead, didn't you? You fell for it, Mummy." "Oliver, this is not funny. You can't go riding on the street like this. You were nearly killed, and you think this is a joke. For a moment I really thought you were gone. I thought I'd lost you. How could you do this to me? Look at you. You've got grazes all over your legs and face. And if you hadn't been wearing your helmet, God forbid." She cradled her son in her arms, rocking him with the gratitude of a very grateful mother who'd been given a miracle and a second chance. The woman with her 2 pugs came dashing over towards them, her face as white as a sheet. "My God! Is your son all right? I saw the whole thing happen. It was horrific. Your son could have been killed." The woman was trembling, holding her hand on her heart. She tried to still her earnest breath. Even her pugs had abandoned their leads and dashed over to Oliver, covering him with their pink tongues. "What is wrong with people around here? Driving down a residential neighbourhood as if they think they're Nigel Mansell. They're clearly deluded. This is insane. We need speed bumps on these roads, I am telling you. I wish to God the council would do something about this. I didn't get the driver's licence. I tried, but it happened so fast. But I think the driver was a teenage boy, if I'm not mistaken. Whoever he is, he needs locking up for driving like this. But this is not the first time someone has driven like that, at such an insane, unforgivable speed. Several people on this street have lost cats to ludicrously dangerous drivers. Something needs to be done about this." She stared in horror as Oliver removed his battered helmet from his head. "If you hadn't been wearing that helmet, young man, I dread to think what would have happened to you. You had a lucky escape. I don't think you would be here." The woman sounded flustered as she walked away, but if she was shaken up, it was nothing on what Carly was feeling. She felt as if there was a large vacuum inside her body that could never be filled. "What on earth is the matter with you, sweetheart?" Carly's husband asked her when he returned home. He knew something was up with his wife. As she was busying herself in the kitchen with a driven determination he only ever observed in her when she was flustered or in some kind of state about something. The last time this had occurred was when her mother had died fortuitously. She was throwing pasta in a bowl of boiling water and doggedly stirring a frying pan full of tomato sauce around and around with a vicious intensity, as if her undivided attention had been demanded by the frying pan and its contents. The delicious smell of oregano, basil, tomato and garlic filtered around the kitchen, but his wife appeared to be oblivious to the fact that he had returned home, as if she hadn't even noticed his arrival. "Carly, I'm home. Are you in there?" her husband teased, knocking on her head. "You look as if you've locked up in some kind of a trance like a yogi. Something bad has happened, has it not?" he asked her. "You gave me a shock. Don't knock on my head like that. I thought... Goodness gracious, you're a nervous wreck, Carly. What on earth is the matter?" She looked at him bemused. Her face was unusually puffy and pale, and he could swear she looked as if she'd been crying. "It's you. I realise it's you, but you did give me a shock. I didn't hear you come home. I wish you had spoken a bit louder." "I don't think I could have spoken louder if I'd tried." "How was your day at the office?" she asked, as if she wasn't really remotely interested in hearing the answer. "Oh, you know, so-so," said Robert, shrugging his shoulders nonchalantly. "My job is hardly riveting, sweetheart. It's as predictable as the weather. Let's just say there's nothing desperately exciting about staring at beige walls day after day and being cooped up in a stuffy office." "Well, what do you want me to do about it?" snapped Carly. "Send in a renovation team to bring colour into your workplace? Is that it?" "Carly, what on earth is wrong with you? Why are you being so—" He looked for the word he needed to use to describe his wife's incongruous behaviour. "So touchy," he said. "Has someone rubbed you up the wrong way?" "It isn't about your father, is it?" he asked. "You're not worrying about him again, are you? The man is quite capable of looking after himself, I'm most sure." With hands on her hips, Carly was staring at her husband with a strange look in her eyes that he couldn't quite discern. "Happy now, Robert? You win." She began to stir the tomato sauce vigorously, and the sauce was beginning to catch as the caramel smells of burn appeared to confiscate the air. "I hope you're happy now. You win." "Sweetheart, the sauce is burning. Switch it off. Take it off the hob. What do you mean I win? What are you talking about?" "We're selling this house. We're leaving Montreal. We're moving to Banff. You can resign from your boring job in the office and we're going to buy a house in the countryside. But we're going to be productive with our lives. Even though I've got lots of money in the bank, we're not becoming my parents. Never becoming my parents. Do you understand? I can't let that happen to us under any circumstances. I cannot let money make us become lazy." "Do you think I'd ever become like your parents? Not a chance in hell, Carly. While I've always liked your parents, and I'm particularly fond of your father because he's quite the charmer, I could never sit about doing nothing for weeks on end. I'm far too industrious and inventive for that. I don't think I could ever retire for that very reason. But what brought this on? You're not making any sense. I thought you were dead set against moving to Banff. I've been begging you for years for this move. And after all this time, you finally agree? What the hell has brought this on? It's not making any sense to me at all. You're usually as stubborn as a mule. When you make your mind up about something and you say no, the woman's not for turning. So what's happened to flip the pancake on the other side? I'm very intrigued." "It's dangerous living here, Robert. Dangerous. We can't possibly stay here. We've got to sell this place, put it on the market, at once." "Dangerous?" said her husband, letting out a laugh. "You're kidding, right? There's nothing dangerous about our lovely neighbourhood. What on earth are you talking about, Carly? You're making no sense. Since I've got back home, you're all over the place. You seem desperately anxious about something. This is a very safe neighbourhood, I assure you. There hasn't been a robbery in this part of Montreal for years. What are you barking on about? I don't understand you. I'm feeling rather bewildered, if you don't mind my saying so." Carly almost growled at her husband. "Oh, do I have to spell it out, Robert, all the time, do you?" She pointed with her finger to the front yard and the road beyond. "That road out there is very dangerous. It's dangerous. We might live in a quiet neighbourhood, but I'm sorry, some of those people that drive down that road on our street are maniacs, absolute maniacs. Some of them drive at a reckless speed. in a residential neighbourhood, and it's for this reason it's not safe to live here anymore. Our son was nearly killed today by a speeding car, and I was 2 days to get the number plates of that awful person that was driving at an insane speed. Oliver was very lucky not to be killed, and it sure didn't help that you removed the training wheels from his bike. How could you do that? How could you do that, Robert? He spun past me on the driveway before I had a chance to even stop him. I watched as the speeding car went colliding into our son. I witnessed his bicycle being flung up on the side of the road, buckling up into scrap metal, as the driver just sped away. Can you believe it? He sped away. What is wrong with people? If Oliver had not been wearing his helmet, I promise you, Robert, he would not be with us now. Let's just say his head would have been pulverised on that road. Luckily, he's only got grazes on his face and knees, but it could have been so much worse. We nearly lost our son today. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Robert? Do you understand why I'm so hyped up? Oh, sweetheart, I don't know what to say. That is terrifying. I can't imagine what you went through. That is the worst thing for a mother to have to see. I'm just glad I wasn't there. He was too close for comfort, Robert. Too close. It could happen again. I've been given a warning sign from God, if you like, the universe, whatever you want to call it, I don't know. We need to move. Next time we might not be so lucky, Robert. It's been a trouble in this street for years, a contentious issue. People have asked for speed bumps to be put in the road. But Mrs. Binglesby, oh, Mrs. Binglesby, always putting her nose into everybody's business. Well, she has some kind of powerful connection with the council. Well, she's put a stop to it. We've got to leave. We haven't got a choice. Robert watched his wife bursting into uncontrollable sobs. There was no comforting her. She was inconsolable with grief. His heart broke for her. He couldn't imagine how frightening it was for her to see her beloved son coming so tragically close to losing his life. It was every parent's worst nightmare. He could see that his wife was replaying the event over and over again in her head like a broken record, blaming herself for what had happened. He knew he had to take some level of responsibility for what had occurred. He regretted removing the training wheels from his son's bicycle, but he had never anticipated this happening. He thought he had got through to his son about the perils of driving on the road, but his son had not paid any attention to his sagacious advice. But to be fair, he was only 5 years old, and although he seemed as bright as a button, he was still incredibly naive, which you would expect from a kid of Oliver's age. He affectionately cradled his wife in his arms, rocking her very gently, like a baby, backwards and forwards, kissing her long chestnut brown hair. "It's going to be all right, I promise you," he told her. "All I can say is thank God our son is all right, and that he was wearing his helmet. Where is he now?" "I've sedated him. I sent him to bed. He's in a terrible state, a delayed reaction, I think. Even in his young age, he knows he came close to losing his life. At first, it was just a big joke to him. He even pretended to be dead when he was lying on the road. But I think it's finally got through to him that this is no laughing matter, when he realised that if he hadn't been wearing that helmet of his, he might not be here, and I think that came as quite a shock to him, and a big wake-up call. He's also upset his bike is completely ruined, and he's asking for another. Well, I think we shan't be getting him another quite so quickly. We'll have to think about that. But I agree with you. Some drivers are treacherous on this street. But we don't have to move to Banff, you know. There are other quieter neighbourhoods in Montreal, where people walk their dogs and cars are not nearly as aggressive as they are here. We could move somewhere like that if you like, onto a street with traffic bumps in the middle of the road. Or we can bring our son's near escape from death to the attention of the council. For our borough, that is. Maybe they will finally listen to us for a change before they have a death on their hands. The speeding on this stretch of road is ludicrous. I've seen it myself." "Not a chance, sweetheart. I'm sorry. I've made up our minds. We're not staying here. We're moving to Banff. And you must give in your notice at work as soon as possible. We're going to be entrepreneurs in our new life. At least it will sort out the problem with my father." "What do you mean, the problem?" "Well, ever since Mum died, things have gone from bad to worse. Dad is so miserable these days without Mum. He's just sinking into a deep, lugubrious depression. I hasten to say the house is looking as bedraggled as it did when I was growing up as a girl. And the inside of the house is disordered and chaotic. It looks as if it's been hit by a tornado. I think when we move to Banff, he should move in with us. I can get his house fixed up for him and put on the market. I was hoping you could encourage him to see that there is life beyond a sofa and a television set and all the books he reads, and give him something to live for. Otherwise, he's quite literally going to waste away, curl up and die, and I couldn't bear to see that happen to him. I heard it happens to geese, you know. They stay together for life and are devoted to each other, and when one dies, the other follows close behind. That's what a broken heart does to you. I remember Mr. Miller had 2 geese. That's exactly what happened to the male after the female died. A week later, he found his healthy male goose dead. He said the male goose was so broken up about the female's demise. The poor thing was never the same again after his partner died. Dad is so much the same as that. He has a broken heart about losing my mother. And being lazy by nature doesn't do him any favours. It's only accelerating the chances of him either getting seriously sick or exiting this planet far too soon. I really don't want to lose my dad. The thought is just too dreadful. You're an influencer and shaker, Robert. You can show my father that even though Mum's gone, he does have something to live for. One thing about Banff, well, it's exquisite. There's the turquoise lakes like Lake Louise, prepossessing scenery that will steal your breath away. If you're miserable in a place like that is literally heaven on earth, then you've seriously got problems. I'm sure a place like that would be so good for my father." "You really think that this is a good idea? Your father moving in with us, I mean?" "Well, it's either that, Robert, or much like my mother, he's going to an early grave. He's still not drinking any beer at all. And ever since Mum died, he's eaten practically nothing. He's wasting away. He's got so slender. My mother only died young because she ate herself to death consuming enough sugar to sink the Titanic. But it's not too late for my father. We can help him recover from his lugubrious melancholia and his grief. Besides, it's good for my dad to be around his grandson. He was always such a great reader. He's a wise, learned old soul. He can teach Oliver so much. Put it this way, I don't think my father would have been so quick to remove the training wheels from Oliver's bike like you did. I think he'd have known better. On the subject of Oliver, we'll have to get him a brand new bike, or we ain't going to hear the end of it. Despite his close call with death, he still wants another bike. That's resilience, believe me." "You say that, sweetheart, because the real truth is you know your father would be far too lazy to remove those training wheels," said Robert, giving his wife a grin. "Am I right, or am I right?" "Oh, right. I admit you have a point. Are we going to Banff or not? Is it agreed?" Robert grinned at Carly with a smile so wide that his lips almost looked lopsided on one side of his face. "You want to bet? I've always wanted to live in Banff. Do I look like I would look a gift horse in the mouth? You're the one who wanted to stay here in Montreal. Not me, I might add. I was the one that said I wanted to live a life surrounded by exquisite scenery. But you were scared I would become like your father, doing nothing. But that's not me. Money will never change me. It's a useful tool, and that's about it. I have no interest in fancy exotic trips to the Mediterranean, exclusive spa treatments, luxurious hotels. I'm a practical guy. A little luxury now and then is nice, but that's about it. I like simplicity most of the time, and I'm certainly not a jet-setter. Travelling the world, you know, is not it's all cracked up to be. It's far too overrated, in my opinion." "I know it is, isn't it, Robert? But I do remember watching this programme once. The family made all their money from Johnson & Johnson. They were stinking rich. The father pottered around his house all day, painting pictures on an easel. The self-entitled son was so spoilt, so full of himself. It truly looked as if clover was growing out of his nostrils and ears. They had it all, but you know what? They had absolutely nothing. It was almost pitiful. It was like all the ambition that they could have procured in this lifetime to make something of their lives was gone because they didn't need to do it. And then you hear of people who come from poverty, who bust their guts to achieve their goals. And they're so accomplished and so fulfilled. So you see, Robert, sometimes inheriting wealth, when you have an aptitude for laziness like my father and mother did, is more than a curse than a blessing. My father's father knew that. He was right. I get where you're going with this, Carly, but I keep telling you that that is not us. I still want to work in Banff, giving something back to the world, to the community. Your finances give us the freedom to do something that I love. That will make a difference. It's not about being lazy. Far from it, in fact. Your fears are unfounded. Our financial freedom will just give us choices, and that's all. Carly looked up to see her son Oliver standing in the kitchen. He was carrying his big blue octopus in his hands and looking at them with wide eyes. "Mummy, my knee really hurts me." "Of course it hurts, sweetheart. You grazed yourself badly today." "If you read me a story, it might feel better, and some warm milk and cookies would be nice, and then my knee, it'll heal very fast. I know it will."
"Hello, sport. Are you going to give your father a hug? I understand you had a bit of an accident today."
"Dad, I went flying off my bike onto the sidewalk. I pretended to be dead. You should have seen Mummy's face. She was crying really badly. Then I felt bad because I gave her a scare. The lady from the street, she's got 2 black dogs with flat faces. She said the whole accident, the man that was driving the car, he didn't stop. The lady said he should be locked up into prison forever and ever, but they didn't get his number plates. She had clever doggies, Daddy, because they knew I'd been hurt. They were licking my knee better and my face. The lady said that my helmet that I wear on my head, that it definitely saved my life. I'm sorry, Daddy, but I didn't mean to cycle fast, but the bicycle wasn't slow without the training wheels."
"I'm sorry, sport. I should never have taken the training wheels off your bicycle, should I? But when it comes to your mother, it wasn't a nice thing to do, pretending to be dead. You gave your mother a big fright. You scared her half to death. And the truth is, you could have been killed today. You must never ride your bicycle on that road again, without being supervised. Do you understand?"
"But I can't anyway, Daddy. The mean man in the car, the one that ran me over or knocked over my bike, he drove into it. He destroyed my bike, Daddy, and now my bike is dead. The bicycle chain came off and the bicycle is all bent up."
"Well, be glad that it was the bicycle that got harmed, and not you. I'm sure he didn't drive into you on purpose, sport, but he was driving way too fast. He was being irresponsible. He probably did not see you on the road, which is why it's best you don't cycle down a dangerous road like that. It may look very peaceful and tranquil, there may not be very much traffic around, but it just takes one car to come driving down that road very fast, not looking where it's going, and trouble ensues. As I keep telling you, you need to be careful."
Robert knew if it wasn't for his 5-year-old son Oliver's serendipitous near-fatal run-in with that car, and the close call he had with death, moving to Banff would not be on the cards for their family, by any manner of means. Indeed, his wife Carly had insisted that they could think about such moves when they were of retirement age, but not now. It was almost like one domino came crashing down, and the others followed in sequence. And this turn of events was in no way negative, but he never expected it would be his 5-year-old son that would facilitate the family move, to pastures green, by putting the fear of God into his wife, who believed the fortuitous accident was some kind of a sign from the gods warning them to leave Montreal, when in reality this accident could have happened in any neighbourhood, in any part of the world. Robert thought about the quirky woman at work, who was considered a bit of an oddball in the office. But for him, she was like a breath of fresh air. She was individualistic, nonconformist, rather eccentric. She had Romany origins and considered herself a gypsy, and was proud of her roots. She wore headscarves on her head every day, long bright skirts, crochet shawls, hundreds of gold bracelets and necklaces. She had nut brown skin, long dark shiny hair, and very intense brown eyes that you could swear could look right through you like a voucher. She was very intimidating for a lot of people in the office, who found her stares quite uncomfortable. The woman claimed to read palms, tea leaves, and the tarot, and one day she caused quite a stir in the office, when she actually brought a crystal ball along to work. People in the office preferred to ignore her, and only gave her attention when her predictions started to come true. She told one lady in the office who was spending a fortune on IVF treatments to fall pregnant not to bother, because she'd have a baby naturally the following year, and it would be a boy. So she didn't need to engage in any fertility treatments, and sure enough that's exactly what happened. So in a moment of boredom, Robert asked her if she saw anything in his tarot cards, and was amazed when she told him she saw him moving away. "I wish," he had grimaced to her, looking at her wistfully. "I'm afraid it's not going to happen," he insisted. "It's not from want of trying, but the lady's not for changing her mind. My wife is mulishly stubborn about such things." Janice lifted up the tower card and showed it to Robert. He squirmed at the sight of such a horrifying card. He saw a tall tower, with people flying out of it, that made him think of the Twin Towers tragedy in New York. Then this was followed by the death card that wasn't good. It looked very ominous. She had laughed. "Don't get anxious, Robert. It's nothing bad. The cards just say your life, as you know it, is going to come tumbling down like the tower here. The death card means the birth of a brand new beginning, the end of an old cycle. I think you must be moving away from your life here in Montreal, going somewhere different, where you're going to be much happier than you are now. I see your dreams being fulfilled. You have the 10 of Pentacles here, followed by the Sun card. It's looking good for you, Robert. Very good." Robert was rather encouraged by the reading with Janice, but he suspected it was all stuff and nonsense, really, not to be taken seriously. So what if she'd been accurate in her predictions about Sally Roper's baby and Robert Morrison's marriage when the man hadn't even started dating his betrothed at the time? Besides, did he really believe in the tarot? No, of course not. But it was nice to dream. All he could think of now was moving to Banff. He adored that part of the world, and the moment he first laid eyes on Lake Louise, he knew he wanted to live in this part of the world more than anything else. The water in that lake had been turquoise, and he'd never seen anything more prepossessing in his entire life. He left the office that day with a significant spring in his step, thinking about Janice's predictions for his future. Could he dare to hope that his family would one day move to Banff? It seemed like such an unattainable pipe dream. He thought he'd slipped into an alternative universe when he arrived home to find his wife wanted to move to Banff. What were the chances of that? He'd never envisaged it happening in all the months of Sundays put together. God never normally heard his prayers when he'd begged him about the matter for the last 5 years or so. Now it was happening, and it seemed so surreal, far too surreal to digest, as if he was sure he'd been dreaming. But no, it really was happening against all the odds. The family, his family, was moving to Banff. Furthermore, it was his wife that was insistent about the move, not him, almost as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes, and she was seeing their lives through a completely different lens. It wouldn't be so great having Carly's father moving in with them. A bit of an imposition, perhaps. But to give him his due, he was an eccentric man with a great sense of humour. If Carly's father, Chuck, had his way, he'd probably just curl up and die. He'd been hopelessly in love with his wife when she was alive. And finally, when she was gone, It would seem something inside him broke. Carly was right. If her father did not move in with them, he probably would die in the next 6 months or so, of a broken heart. He was failing to take better care of himself. If having the father-in-law moving in with them to their brand new home in Banff was what was on the cards, it certainly was a small price to pay, to wake up to those prepossessing views every day of the week. Maybe he'd get involved in the tourist industry, offering people hiking expeditions in the countryside. He'd think about it. He knew that Carly was terrified that with her hefty bank balance, that she and Robert would follow in her parents' footsteps and become lazy slobs. But that would never happen. They weren't naturally lazy as a couple, and they loved to embrace an adventurous lifestyle, and doing nothing was not in their DNA. Robert had loathed his job at the office, working for a drudgerous accounting company that was privately owned in Montreal, and spending his days behind a computer, staring at the bleak, oppressive, joyless white wall, along with an old calendar that had not been removed for over 5 years, thanks to 50-year-old Doreen Douglas. She had hung the hunky fireman's calendar on the wall, and loved to look at it every day of the week. It displayed 12 beefy, rather brawny-looking firemen, wearing no shirts and sitting on the backs of Harley-Davidsons or standing on the fire truck, in very suggestive poses with their bulking pecs. They were strapping, muscular, shredded men for every single month of the year, and she was in love with Mr. April, so the calendar remained rigidly fixed on April, despite the fact that it was years out of date. And maybe Mr. April didn't look like that anymore. But try telling that to Doreen Douglas, who had been having an affair with Mr. April for 5 successive years. Only it was a love affair in her head, and she would stare at that calendar as if Mr. April was her long-lost love. Robert wished to God it wasn't on his wall next to his desk, but Doris didn't have a wall, so had borrowed his wall space, so she could view her fireman from the opposite side of the desk, where her computer was set up. Recently a new recruit whom arrived at the office, who was gay, had been given Robert the approving eye, and flirting outrageously with him. "I won't tell your wife if you don't," he had whispered to Robert in his ear. "I've been with many married men before. I'm very discreet, you know. Mum's the word. I find you very attractive, Robert. I don't believe in keeping my feelings contained. I wear my heart on my sleeve, you know. Just so you know, for the record, you've got excellent taste in men," he said, giving him a wink. "And by the way, just between you and me, I have a very similar tattoo on my derriere that you would love." "Sorry, what are you talking about?" Robert had asked. "I'm not gay. I'm happily married." The young man had tapped his nose as if to say he knew different. "You're very shy, Robert. How very sweet. I like it when my men are shy. Why are you acting so coy? There really is no need to be embarrassed," he said, pointing to the calendar with a huge grin on his face. "Oh, that," said Robert. "I might have known. That's not mine. It belongs to Doris over there. It's not my calendar. She's the one interested in the fireman with the big pecs and the cryptic tattoos. I'm not into that kind of thing. I like women." The new recruit looked disappointed. "Life's a bitch. Why do the best men have to be taken? Why do they have to not be gay? It's so not fair. Story of my life. I thought I was on to a winner with you, Robert." "Sorry, no can do," said Robert. The mood in that office, day in and day out, was depressing, and everyone couldn't wait for the dials on the clock to finally turn to the 5 o'clock marking. But that sometimes took an agonizing long time to happen. Then, like a flock of geese, everyone flew out of that office so fast. They were longing to return to their roosting places and cosy homes, gladdened that the drudgerous day was finally behind them. In truth, no one enjoyed working in that stuffy office, doing the same things day in and day out, like hamsters going around and around on a wheel. It was a dead-end job from which Robert and his business colleagues derived very little satisfaction, as all the challenging decisions in the job were made by the senior executives in the company. It was an unfair environment, where nepotism reigned supreme, so any promotions were kept strictly within the family. Even if the person in question was not qualified for the job, if they were associated with the Riley family, in one way or another they were crowned with a position of privilege and honour, even if they were completely incompetent. It had naturally meant anyone with the company with any aspiring ambitions had no chance of being promoted, unless they had a special connection with the Riley family, so people were naturally forever discouraged. Robert and his wife were financially free, which really was a blessing. Carly's father had given his wife and her brother a hefty chunk of their inheritance while he was alive, to save inheritance taxes, which was a clever thing to do. Robert had tried to persuade his wife Carly that with their financial freedom they could live anywhere in the world they wanted to. He had always dreamed of living in Banff, which was as picturesque as the views you'll see on a box of Swiss chocolates. But his wife had been against the idea, because of the fear of becoming like her parents and never doing a damn thing. It was a very real fear of his wife's, rooted from a childhood where she'd lived in a house that almost looked abandoned and derelict, because both of her parents had been too lazy to concern themselves with its general maintenance and upkeep. They just didn't bother, his wife had told him. It was so humiliating for us, because our house was the eyesore in the street, with knee-high grass, warped shutters, and me and my brother Larry felt very self-conscious about that. Don't get me wrong, my parents were wonderful people, but let's just say their lackadaisical approach towards life left much to be desired. 1 year later, Robert's account. Moving to Banff was the best decision my family could have ever made, and I knew what an immense privilege it was for us to live in such a prepossessing, idyllic part of the world. And its magic had even transformed my father-in-law Chuck from a broken man who had lost his will to live to someone who woke up with a spring in his step and a purpose in his heart every single day. He thoroughly enjoyed taking a stroll out of doors, which was something he hadn't done for over 50 long years. It was wonderful for Oliver to have his grandfather around, and the man could make you laugh so much that your belly would ache. He was a well-learned man who knew much about many things, and had taken on to helping Oliver read very eloquently for one so young. We moved to an exclusive neighbourhood called Breer, a stone's throw away from Whistler's village, referred to as the Sunridge Plateau. We moved into a sizable house with 6 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms that was perched on a 2,000 square foot lot. The house boasted 18-foot ceilings with salt stone walls that contained wood-burning and gas-assisted fireplaces, which people tend to like a great deal in Whistler, as it regulates the temperature, I'm told. When my wife's father moved in, I genuinely thought that the man was too set in his ways, and that it would take a herd of gallivanting bison to uproot him from the sofa, where he'd be seated for the lion's share of the day, watching television or reading books by a cosy fire. When he first agreed to move in, he was very reluctant and worried he'd be imposing on us, but we assured him that we would like him very much to live with us. In the beginning I thought we'd made a grievous mistake, inviting Chuck to move in, as my wife's father did nothing all day but fall asleep by the couch, barely moving a muscle. It was obvious that this man had become a shadow of his former self, but one day that all changed. It all began one unassuming day, when you least expect something strange to occur, and then it invariably does. Me and my wife and our son Oliver were out shopping in Whistler. My father-in-law was sitting comfortably by a fire reading a book. Then he heard a scratching sound at the door. It was very strange, so he quickly went to open it to see what was going on. He discovered a beautiful white dog, resembling a wolf, standing at the door, with a desperate, pleading look in his sad, dark eyes. The dog looked emaciated and thin. He sensed it was asking him for help, as if personally seeking him out. He thought such a fabulous dog had to belong to someone, but seeing the skeletal bones sticking out of the dog's skin so pointedly, like gnarled ropes, it was clear the animal was half-starved. He was grievously concerned about the dog's welfare, so he brought the dog into the house to lie by the crackling fire, and to eat a plate of human food. And that dog ate and ate as if his life depended on it. My father-in-law made some inquiries to find out if anyone was missing this dog, but no one came forward to claim her, and he secretly hoped they wouldn't. He said from the moment he laid eyes on Snow White, he knew that they were like-minded souls going through great anguish together, and in each other they saw a kindred spirit. Chuck did not want to let the dog freeze to death, so he brought her into the house, not caring how we would react to this furry friend. But no one was more delighted than my son Oliver, who thought the dog was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen.
She looks like the snow, so white. Her eyes are dark, like the ink in my pen. I really like her, Pops. She's the best dog that I've ever seen in my life, and she looks so clever. That's because she is clever, Sport. Why do you think she came to the door to ask for help? That's because she is clever. Exactly, that's what I say. I knew she was clever.
My father-in-law became incredibly attached to his female companion that he chose to call Snow White, because of her white resplendent coat that grew more and more magnificent every day, and also because she came from the brink of death, rather like the character in the fairy tale, after eating the poison apple. She really was magnificent, and looked more like a wolf than a dog. My wife believed Snow White was an angel in dog's clothes, as no one claimed her, despite there even being an announcement about her on the local radio. She appeared out of the blue from nowhere, and she completely delivered my father-in-law from his lugubrious melancholia, as if a dark cloud had been lifted off his life, and in its place a rainbow had arrived. The man who in the past could not be persuaded to walk from the living room to the kitchen unless there was a reward of dinner being served, was now determined to take responsibility for Snow White, who was dependent on him for exercise. So began my father-in-law's regular trips in his white Range Rover to a very stunning location outside Banff, where you can walk up this mountainous elevation on a prepossessing trail, which I gather is very secret. Not many people know about it. Surrounded by exquisite scenic vistas, and it appears to be dog-friendly. This eccentric man, who could barely move a muscle because it was too much like hard work, became fitter and more nimble on his feet, all because he wanted to make Snow White happy and to give her the life she deserved. Such was his devotion and loyalty to Snow White, which was reciprocated 100-fold, for the dog never left his side. It was extraordinary how the heaviness that had formerly swallowed up his joy like a whale had been lifted off him, and he no longer wallowed in his grief and despair, for he had something else to think about beyond his late wife. It would seem Snow White had given him a purpose for living. This gorgeous-looking Arctic wolf-like creature had reached out to Chuck for help, and it was as if he almost forgot about his own dreadful loss by helping out the distressed dog, who needed him, and in alleviating her pain, he'd managed to extinguish his own. In no time at all, Snow White picked up weight, becoming a devoted, loving member of our household, who attached herself to my father-in-law like a barnacle on a rock. It was difficult to tear the two apart, even with the temptation of a stunning steak on offer, or a ball being thrown in the basement by Oliver. She was not interested unless it was Chuck presenting her with the steak, or Chuck throwing the ball. I hasten to say that dog loved the bones of Chuck, and knew unequivocally he'd saved her life, so in her eyes Chuck was her quintessential hero. I hasten to say when someone has a will to live, their health improves exponentially. Chuck's pasty face had become flushed with pink. His eyes, once almost deadened by grief, sparkled with renewed hope, and one day he even agreed to go to the barber's to have his hair cut, and my father-in-law looked decidedly more handsome after that pruning, which involved an old-fashioned close-cut shave, where his long white sideburns that the hairstylist told him had gone out of fashion a long time ago were finally removed. My wife took her dad to McCool's, which is a one-stop shop for all your outdoor gear in Whistler's, and he was kitted out with nifty attire and very robust walking boots, so that he could take Snow White for plenty of outdoor exercise, wearing the right type of gear. In the evening, Snow White would lie across Chuck's legs while he was reading, like a long, furry foot-warmer, and soon became an invaluable member of our family, loved by us all very dearly. He was also a comedian, much like my father, making us laugh all the time, as if by hanging around Chuck He'd also picked up some of his quirky characteristics. When she was hungry, she'd pick up her food bowl in her mouth and drop it on my father-in-law's lap. She would sit there on her haunches, her dark eyes fixed on him, patting him on the knee with her paw. My father-in-law would pretend not to notice, so she'd lift the food bowl off his lap and throw it on his feet to get his attention. Once again she would pat his knee with her paw, as if to say, "Go on, don't be so lazy. Are you going to feed me or not?" My father-in-law would throw down his book and say, all right, Snow White, food is on its way." And he would trudge over to the kitchen to fill up Snow White's bowl with pellets. And once she'd gobbled it all up, she'd pat him with her paw again to say thank you. The bond between man and dog took my breath away. It was beautiful to watch. I'd never seen such devotion before. My father-in-law became friendly with all the locals in town, who loved him and his quirky sense of humour. In Whistler he was known as the debonair man with the white hair, who went everywhere with his white dog. It was easy for my father-in-law to gain that debonair reputation, after, of course, shedding all that walrus-like blubber from the past. I had built some asphalt bicycle paths on our property, so that my son Oliver could cycle around to his heart's content, without worrying about any oncoming traffic, and the relief that this little exercise brought my wife was immeasurable. She believed our move to Banff was serendipitously preordained, and that the universe had given us one warning to move after my son had experienced that fortuitous accident on his bike. "I don't know, Robert," she told me, "but there was a distinctive voice in my head that said if you don't leave Montreal, then the next time this happens, your son might be killed." I knew the voice was right, as our son is so obstinate at the very best of times, and impulsively makes decisions that later on he regrets. And I knew the same accident could happen again, but this time our Oliver would never escape with his life. Twice lucky, I don't think so. I had to pay attention to that inner voice, which is why we came here. My wife would walk to the ends of the earth if it meant saving her son's life. She told me her mother had always taught her to listen to that intuitive nudge, because it was always important and should never be ignored. She told her daughter that the day she left Sylvia the cat out in the snow overnight, a voice in her head told her to leave the window open a little, but she thought that was crazy, and Sylvia nearly froze to death as a result. If her mother had left the kitchen window slightly ajar, Sylvia would have got into the house easily, and not moved to the old lady's house next door, as the idea of being left out in the snow again was not acceptable for the poor cat. For me personally, I was very happy to be enjoying a brand new life in Banff, and certainly did not miss my old job in Montreal, nor the hunky old calendar of the firemen staring at me from 9 to 5 every day. There were far more attractive things for my eyes to be feasting on, and the scenery in Banff was certainly one of those things. I had already taken tourists on hiking trails with great success, and my wife's fear of my becoming a redundant layabout amounted to nothing. Soon I was encouraging my father-in-law to regularly come fishing with me, to go here, to go there, and he was becoming alive, rather like a strangled orchid whose roots has been stuffed in a tight container for a very long period of time, suddenly being released and being able to breathe again, once those dying, distressed roots are loosened from their tangled confinement. It was miraculous to observe the dramatic but beautiful transformations in my father-in-law, which no one welcomed more than my wife. "Did I not tell you, or did I not tell you, it would be great if my dad moved in with us? He's such a lovable teddy bear, isn't he? Our household has become so complete, and Oliver simply adores his grandfather, who reads to him, tells him stories all the time. And what little boy doesn't adore a big white fluffy dog to cuddle up to? I believe if my father had not moved in with us, he'd be deceased by now. I don't just think it, I know it. These days he's balanced his excessive reading with physical exercise. He's no longer on high blood pressure medication, and looks better and younger than he's done so in years. I don't think he would be here, and I mean that, Robert, if he hadn't moved in with us. And I believe our sacrifice has turned out to be our biggest blessing. I've never felt so close to my father as I do now. It seems so natural to be living together 3 generations in one family. I think I'm beginning to understand, Robert, why some Mediterranean families live together. Grandparents and grandchildren alike. It actually works. When I listen to my father talking to our son, giving him such wizened advice from such an old soul, I can see our son is more mature than most in his year. My father has taught him so much. That's why the elders in some cultures are highly esteemed for their sagacious wisdom, you know. Do you know his teacher says he's so advanced for his year? And I think he has his grandpa Chuck to thank for that. One day, little did I know that this day would not follow the usual trajectory of all the previous days, and that something rather peculiar was about to transpire. When a fortuitous event you don't see coming arrives on the scene, no one is prepared for it. It's a little like planning a party, and never for a moment had you anticipated rain, but the rain comes, and it throws all your plans out of the window like an apple core on the side of the road. The day had started much like any other, and that was the way I thought it would end, with the usual family routines coming into play. But that is not what happened. It was autumn and a particularly beautiful time of year in Banff, for some of the trees were bedecked with a confetti of gold, red or amber leaves, and against the blue sky and the green rolling countryside, it was a feast for the eyes. It was in the late afternoon that my father-in-law Chuck Fournier decided he'd take Snow White for a walk at their favourite spot.
"I've been a bit lazy today," he told me. "The novel I was reading, well, it was so gripping. I simply couldn't put it down. But Snow White has been very patient with me all day, and we both need some fresh air and exercise." "Look at the time, Chuck," I said gingerly. "Are you sure that this is a good idea? I don't mean to put a spanner in the works, but it's nippy outdoors now. It's getting dark early. You don't want to find yourself getting caught up on a hiking trail at this time, especially if it gets dark." "Look, Robert, you're sounding exactly like my daughter. Will you relax? I'm not going to be long. We're just going on the hiking trail that I always take every day. Snow White loves it there. I'm not going to deprive her of that. We just won't be gone for as long as I usually am, but we'll be back before it gets dark. I'm quite sure, Chuck, that Snow White here will forgive you if she misses out on just one walk. I personally think it's ridiculous to venture out now. I'm sure all the locals in Whistler would agree with me and advise you not to walk so late in the day, especially in autumn when it gets dark quickly." My strong-willed father-in-law was as wilfully obstinate and headstrong as my wife. I knew there was no arguing with him, as the stubborn, obdurate streak in the Fournier family line had been inherited by my son Oliver. I knew all about dealing with intractable, doggedly inflexible people who are resolutely bull-headed about something. If you try to persuade them any different and ask them to listen to you, they'll become contrary and even more iron-willed and unbending. I decided to let my father-in-law make his own decisions for himself. I could not dictate his life choices. It wasn't my place to do so. I watched him put on his puffer jacket, his scarf around his neck, and his walking boots on his feet. He gave me a nod and said, "See you soon, Robert. As I told you, I won't be gone for terribly long." Then Snow White, with her tail wagging happily, bounded after him, letting out a couple of delighted woofs and giving me a look as if to say, "My master would never ever let me down, not like you. I'm going for walkies." I watched the white dog diving into the passenger side seat of Chuck's Range Rover, and they drove away. I'm not a superstitious person, served with an intuitive mindset like my wife is, but I will say this. Something did not feel right about my father-in-law leaving for a walk at this late time of the afternoon. It left me with chills running down my spine and an unsavoury bitter taste polluting the back of my throat. But there was not a damn thing I could do about it. It was a pity my wife was in Banff, having attended a pizza party with Oliver and friends. If she had been home, she'd have persuaded her father not to go out for this walk, because one stubborn person talking to another is far more effective than anything else I know.
It's as if they know how to break down the barriers of this unyielding war of willfulness that is so typical of my father-in-law. Why did I have an overwhelming feeling that he would get himself into trouble? I wish to God the feeling would leave me, but it clung to me like sticky chewing gum that you cannot easily remove, leaving me feeling decidedly apprehensive. I was soon to learn that I had a lot to be apprehensive about. Chuck's account. When my wife died, I really thought my life was over. I stopped eating. I no longer drowned my sorrows in cans of beer, as you might expect I would. I had reached the startling revelation that I had nothing left to live for. I was quite happy to die, and I reached a peace about it. I didn't want to go on with my life if it meant living without her, and I'm sure many men who've lost their wives in similar circumstances understand where I'm coming from. When my daughter began to insist that I move to Banff and live in the home they purchased, I thought it was a very bad idea. I certainly did not want to impose on my daughter's kindness, and nor did I want to live any more, although I did not wish to share this sorry information with her, as that would have made her very sad. That was the way I felt. Moving in with them would mean I'd have to make some kind of an effort to do my part in reading to my grandson Oliver and helping my daughter around the house. I didn't want any of that. I just wanted to curl up and die. I was happy with that choice. Without my wife, without her cute smiling face, the big dimples and lively personality, what did I have to live for? Nothing. I just wanted to fade away like the summer flowers at the end of the season. I was ready for that and had no fear of death. As like the perennial flowers, I knew I would be back, with a much more nimble body next time, and hopefully my wife would be in the picture again. I had been a very well-read man all my life, and I'm afraid I lived a very sedentary lifestyle, doing the bare minimum with my wife, who shared in my lazy tendencies. But we were like two happy Teletubbies, enjoying the sanctuary of our home together, which in the early years of my children's life, I'm ashamed to confess, was the most derelict house in the neighbourhood due to my neglect and my inability to leave a good novel behind to attend to some grass that decided to grow offensively long. On the outside, our home looked a sorry bedraggled sight in our neighbourhood, but on the inside it was a cosy den that could get a little untidy at times, as I was useless with housework, and I wouldn't be the remotest bit offended, but there you go. It distressed me that my obsession with reading and watching sport on the box, along with drinking so many beers, had done this to both of my kids. My father told me on his deathbed that he didn't want to leave me his vast fortune, as I was predisposed to being lackadaisical, and he was right about that. All my father's money meant was that I had the freedom to do what I liked, which was so liberating, but probably not in a good way. I could hibernate in my home like a very contented black bear. Do I regret it? Not really, as strange as that may sound. I lived my life very contentedly through my books. I also thoroughly enjoyed my interactions with my beloved wife and children, who made me smile all the time, and I thoroughly enjoyed the company of friends. You can live a very fulfilled life from your sofa if you keep yourself mentally stimulated. But my body was retaliating from my couch potato lifestyle, and my doctor had told me as much. "If you don't move a little more, Mr. Funnier, you will be joining your wife in an early grave." My blood pressure was through the roof, and even the medications I was taking would only adjust the blood pressure readings by a small amount. They were still insanely high. At the time I was overweight, with a stomach that hung over my pants that was so large it seriously looked as if I was about to give birth to triplets. But after my wife died, I shed the weight effortlessly easily, along with the beer gut, as my desire to eat had died with my wife. When I moved into the mansion in Whistler, with my daughter, her husband and Oliver, I was almost certainly arrested by the spectacular views that stirred up my dying, defeated spirit, making me realize that there really was life beyond my wife's death. But I was still in that very dark, foreboding, depressing place. But that was all about to change, in a fortuitous way I never envisaged possible, with a serendipitous event that I believe shook me out of my lugubrious melancholia. and it helped me to stop feeling so dreadfully sorry for myself. One day when my daughter, her husband and my grandson Oliver had been invited to dinner with one local in Whistler, I had rejected the invite. I still wasn't in a good place and needed some time to myself. I was sitting by a warm fireplace in the living room, and I heard the scratching sound while I was reading a novel. Even though the fire in the grate was crackling and spitting away heartily, the scratching sound was isolated and very distinctive. It got my attention at once. I stopped reading and listened attentively. The scratching continued, and it was accompanied by a whining sound. What the hell, I thought. What on earth is making that sound? It was beginning to annoy me ever so slightly, so I plonked my book down on the coffee table with a bookmark to secure the place. I rose out of the couch and followed the sound down the passage to the front door. I opened it curiously, and outside the front door was a dog who looked much more sorrowful than I did, and my heart reached out to her. She was magnificently beautiful, but so emaciated, with her ribs jutting out of her coat like wiry coat hangers, and her white hair was matted and dull. Those black eyes stared at me pleadingly, and I knew this dog was reaching out to me for help. How could I possibly turn her away? I wanted to save her more than anything else in the world. I wanted to help her get flesh on her bones and give her a warm, comfortable place to sleep. In that moment my attention was diverted away from my miserable self towards something else worthy of my attention that clearly needed my help, and an unlikely bond was born between the both of us that I never saw coming. In that moment I was like a candle wick that had been smouldering as it started to die out, but now the flame on the wick had been reignited. When your life has no purpose, you're as good as dead, but when you find a reason to live, then you want to thrive, and the idea of dying loses its appeal very fast. I decided to call my dog Snow White, because Snow White nearly died of eating a poison apple in the fairy tale. And in my dog's case, the poison was her impoverishment, her starvation, her inability to find somewhere warm to sleep. But in finding our home, in finding me, she was delivered from her deadly plight, like when the prince found Snow White and kissed her back to life again. I hasten to say, when no one claimed Snow White, I did ponder where on earth she'd come from. But this dog saved my life, more than I actually saved hers. But together we were kindred spirits that could relate to each other's pain. It was on an autumn afternoon I got very involved in a novel I was reading, not so much for the content, but simply because it was so well written. It had me on the edge of my chair, and was significantly hard to put down. These days not many novels had that kind of power over me, but this one had me hooked. I had to find out who the murderer was, although I almost certainly knew. I had my sneaky suspicions it was a woman called Abby, who had been giving her victim the evil eye for many long years, and wanted to kill him, for she had a secret interest in the man's wife, and wanted him well out of the way. But tragically for her, the man's wife had no affection for Abby, and was not that way inclined. The clock began ticking away, and Snow White, who was lying across my feet, kept glancing up at me in anticipation, with that hopeful, eager look in her dark eyes. "Are we going for a walk or not?" I had fortunately become very fit since Snow White had entered my life. I had discovered a prepossessing hiking trail on a slight mountainous incline, where you walked through a wood grove until you got to the top of this mountain, and you could look down on the valley below, over exquisite views onto a turquoise lake, almost as enchanting as Lake Louise, but a whole lot smaller, of course. One of the locals in Whistler confided in me about this hiking trail, swearing me to secrecy. "Don't tell anyone about it," he told me. "I don't want tourists to find out about this place. It's our little secret," he said, tapping his nose. I have no idea why he had confided in me about this location, but I had taken my son-in-law on the trail, and he agreed it was absolutely incredible. There are no words to describe its ambience, its serenity, and sheer beauty. It was such a tranquil paradise that was simply postcard perfect. So I won't even bother to try and tell you how bewitching it was, for words fail to epitomize its sheer magnificence. And certainly during the autumn months, So many of the trees were richly bedecked in resplendent garlands of gold and red leaves, and it was absolutely breathtaking. Snow White, with her spirited energy and rambunctious enthusiasm, thoroughly enjoyed venturing up this mountainous trail, appearing to love it as much as I did, as there was always new scent signatures for her to explore. I climbed out of the upholstered chair with a measure of reluctance. The fire was crackling away merrily in the grate. It was rather difficult to squirrel myself away from such luxurious comfort, especially when it was so warm and cosy inside the house. But with Snow White eager to go for a walk, how could I refuse her? How could I let her down? My son-in-law Robert was at the desk in the lounge, making some notes. He looked up at me with a frown developing between his brows, when he heard me call out to Snow White,
"Are you coming, girl? We're going for a walk. Coming?" "Where are you going, Chuck?" he asked me. "It's nippy out there. It'll be dark soon. Why would you take Snow White out now? Let her go for a run in the yard, but you don't need to go walking with her." "Oh, but I do," I told Robert. "I won't be long. I remember reading somewhere that even if you take a dog for a 10-minute stroll, as opposed to half an hour, they won't even know the difference, but they'll feel as if they've gone out." I knew, of course, my son-in-law was right, but I never liked to give him the credit when it was due. Instead, I liked to be obstinate. It seems to be a natural instinct of mine. It would get dark soon. The weather was chilly, but I would be quick, and try as he might to discourage me, he couldn't persuade me to change my mind. Soon I was in my white Ranger, with Snow White sitting opposite me, with her long nose smudging the passenger side window as she peered out at the landscape. Before long we arrived at the parking area outside the trail, which was empty, as no one knows about this marvellous place, even hardened locals who have lived in Whistler for many long years. So I was privileged to bring my dog here. The moment I parked the car, Snow White began to wag her tail furiously and let out a couple of excited woofs. I opened the door for her, and she bolted past me. Moments later we were ambling at an increased speed down the earthen trail, where on every side we were surrounded by tall, lofty trees, some elegantly swathed in exquisite leafy overcoats of gold, red and amber. My walking boots were beating briskly against the decaying leaf litter, some that was so dried up and crunchy it sounded like a packet of chips being smashed beneath heavy soles. Snow White had her attentive, discerning nose pinned to the earthen floor, as she pilferaged the trail for any exciting scent markings that aroused her interest, and as usual she seemed riveted and fully absorbed. She looked at me through dark, soulful eyes, and woofed a couple of times, as if to say, "Wouldn't you like to know?" Then she ebulliently scooted ahead of me. The trail looked much as it had done any other day of the week, but being later on in the afternoon was even more transfixing, as the golden glaze of the sun beginning to set over the valley was breathtakingly beautiful, and the earthen floor was covered with a confetti of golden leaves that was mesmerizing at this time of the day, under the ethereal light of the late afternoon. I decided I could be no more than 15 minutes on this trail. I would need to head straight back. I resigned myself to the unfortunate fact that, as usual, my son-in-law was absolutely right, and if I didn't make tracks back to the car soon, when the light was waning, I could easily get caught up in the dark. I guess I had not bargained on a faithless son, being so hell-bent on letting me down, by retiring fast, reticently shrinking into the shadows, as if hiding her light under a bushel, and only intent on staining the sky for a few fleeting minutes in a rich kaleidoscope of golds, tangerines and oranges, then shrinking subserviently behind the clouds. It was as if in 1 minute the sunset was there, and the next minute those pretty colours were confiscated by a smouldering grey colour, as the dingy twilight was beginning to roll in, with an assiduous determination that could not be thwarted. I was feeling bitterly disappointed. I was so invigorated, refreshed, and thoroughly enjoying the fresh air blowing against my skin, and the feeling of stretching my stiff legs. But now I really needed to head back, because I did not want to be wrestling with the gloomy oppression of a dark night,
and with only a tiny torch in my jacket pocket, fumbling around in the darkness and navigating my way through this woodgrove would not be an easy task. The wind stepped up its speed and whistled through the trees vigorously. Branches were swinging up and down rather precariously. The breeze whipped up gold autumn leaves like celestial butterflies that brushed past my skin. And that was when I heard a baby crying. My first thought was, oh my God, someone has dumped their baby in this woodgrove, and this poor little mite would never survive the night. It could be anywhere. I'd recently read a true story of a woman who abandoned her baby in the woods. The baby was looked after overnight by wolves. Then the pack leader of the wolves led a kind farmer to the baby, and he adopted her as his own little girl. It was ironic, as the previous summer this farmer had lost his 1-year-old baby to SIDS, which is known as sudden infant death syndrome, where a baby dies for no medical reason at all. When the farmer discovered this baby, his broken heart began to recover, as it represented a green shoot of recovery in his life. No one knew who the mother was, and she was never found, and why she abandoned her child, that remains a mystery. I became very concerned for the baby's cries in the woodgrove, that sounded much like my babies had done when they were little. I felt grievously angry with the mother, whoever she was, for being so negligent and selfish. I couldn't just turn around and go back home, or I'd be worrying about this baby. It was as if Snow White had read my mind, because she began to run through the woodgrove with me tagging behind her, as if she knew exactly where we would find this abandoned child. I had images of a teenager giving birth in a toilet cubicle and coming out to the countryside to leave the baby for the wild animals to eat. You would think that that kind of preposterous thing would not happen these days. But stuff like this still goes on behind closed doors. But most of us don't know about it. And all over the world, abandoned babies are left in all kinds of precarious places, in the hope they might be found by a random stranger. But out here, there were no chances of that happening. Maybe with DNA profiles so good these days, the mother wanted her baby gone for good. You never know what goes on inside people's heads. I won't deny I was intimidated by the gloomy sky that hovered over my head and steeped through the trees, the colour of black tea. It was as if someone was gradually turning down the dimmer switch, so it was slowly growing darker and darker and darker. Snow White bounded towards a distinctive sculptural tree with branches that opened up like a mother's warm hug. And that was when I saw a bundle lying in the tree branch, in a woven basket covered in a deer pelt. I removed the basket from the tree, thinking that I was caught up in a similar situation as Moses and the bulrushes, when that Egyptian woman discovered little Moses lying in a basket, only this basket was contained in a tree and not floating above the water. The baby was howling, and I pulled it out of the deer pelt, and to my amazement discovered it was covered in hair, but it had a very cute human face and bright brown eyes. Is this why the mother had abandoned her child, I wondered? She recognized that her son was not like normal babies, and had a physical impediment. The baby was born with way too much hair. But there were things that could be done with problems like that these days. I had heard about this condition before. I didn't doubt for a moment that the baby was human. I rocked it tenderly in my arms. Snow White licked her little face, and the baby immediately stopped crying and began to gurgle happily. Truly it was one of the cutest babies I have ever seen, despite her physical impediment. I then picked her up in the basket and carried it down the trail, wondering what kind of reaction I'd get from my daughter and her husband when they saw the hairy little mite that I brought home with me. I was getting good at picking up abandoned strays. I was wondering if I might be able to persuade my daughter to adopt the poor little thing, as in my advancing years I would not be in a good position to take on such a responsibility. But we did have the financial means to afford the finest doctors for the little child, who could address the problem with hair. But this little mite deserved to have a promising future, and the mother abandoning her child like this was disgusting as far as I was concerned. As these thoughts rolled through my head, I suddenly heard heavy feet pounding the ground. It sounded as if a cantankerous rhino with an axe to grind was charging towards me. The The ground wobbled, heaved, vibrated under its powerful thrusts. My first thought was, what the hell is that? The woodgrove suddenly became airily quiet, as the crickets and frogs that had begun their cheerful chorus suddenly became cloyingly mute. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up on end, and I knew something was terribly wrong. My heart began to flutter violently in my chest like a terrified bird, and every single cell in my body was screaming, "Run, Chuck, run!" But my legs were weighed down by blocks of cement. As I tried to pick up speed, I felt as if I was clawing my way against an invisible wall of resistance, as if hands I could not see were anchoring me firmly to the ground. A feeling of impending dread overwhelmed me, and I could swear a voice echoed through me, screaming, "No! No! No!" Snow White began to growl, and the hair on her back doubled up in size, so she looked absolutely enormous. She was glancing behind her, with a look of fear on her face, as if she could pick up a foreboding energy on the wind that she did not like. Something was after us, and whatever it was big, it was predatory, it was dangerous. For a moment I saw my life flashing before me, as I anticipated that this was it for me, and in that moment the death I had so longed for, I denied, for I realized more than anything I wanted to live. I could sense the predator before I actually saw it, and I knew I was in grievous trouble, and this poor little baby in the basket didn't stand a fighting chance. I was doomed. We were doomed. The next thing I knew was a stone went flying in my direction, and I heard a loud, frantic scream. It was almost disembodied, hauntingly scary. The stone was huge, missing me by mere inches. I turned around to see this giant hairy woman that I knew at once was a Bigfoot. She stood up on 2 feet, covered in cinnamon-colour hair, with a white patch under her chin. She was robust, powerful, mighty, her body nimble, dense with muscle. She looked so intimidating, standing up at 9 foot tall and probably 800 pounds, and I don't doubt for a second she would have the strength to lift up a car. That's how powerful she was. But this hairy lady was not pleased with me. She was oscillating her arms at me furiously, waving them around in indignation, screaming at me in a strange language. "Kilakikwa! Kilakwika! Kilakwikwa! Homakilaki! Hobakina!" She began to run towards me. I think she said, "What are you doing with my baby? What are you doing?" I couldn't react in time. I was so bemused, so startled by what I was observing. The next thing I knew, she'd grabbed me violently and thrown me off the ground. She hit me with a fist on the side of my head, and everything went black. If she'd intended to harm me, she could have inflicted greater damage, but she just knocked me out. The way she reacted was very natural for an affronted mother. I'm really surprised she did not kill me, and thankful for that too. I'm not sure, wearing her shoes, I would have been quite so considerate in the circumstances, as it seemed as if I was abducting her baby. I am glad to say my son-in-law found me in the woodgrove with Snow White lying over my body to keep me warm. That's how faithful and loyal my dog was. I was concussed for a day or so, and when I remembered what had happened, I was angry with myself for not realizing that this creature was not a human baby, but it had looked so human in every way. I returned to the woodgrove to make amends. I left a huge basket of treats for the female Bigfoot. I have continued to take that hiking trail, and on one occasion I saw a female Bigfoot, who looked up at me and nodded, and then glided away. So I do think I've made my peace with her. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. My word, can you imagine finding a baby Bigfoot in the woodgrove and you actually think it's human, and you find out that it's actually not, and you're greeted to a very angry female Bigfoot. Personally, I'm surprised she didn't kill him, because I think even a human mother might do the very same when you think someone's abducting your baby. Wow, what an extraordinary story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.